Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity settles in quietly and history unfolds at an unhurried pace. Tonight we turn our attention to a monument that has watched the horizon for thousands of years. Its stone face calm, its body stretched across the plateau as though resting between breaths. The Great Sphinx of Giza is familiar to nearly everyone, yet the ground beneath it has inspired as much fascination as the monument itself. Beneath the lion's paws and under the weathered limestone body, there have long been whispers of hidden chambers, sealed passages, and spaces that may or may not exist. It is a strange thing to think about, a statue so massive and so exposed to the desert sun, and yet the real mystery may lie below eye level, concealed in rock and sand. We look at the Sphinx and see a face, a monument, a relic of ancient Egypt. But beneath it, according to rumour and investigation alike, there could be voids, tunnels and cavities carved by nature or shaped by human hands. The idea has lingered for generations, drifting between archaeology and legend, between measured survey and imaginative speculation. As you settle in tonight, perhaps somewhere far from the Giza Plateau, perhaps in a city where the night hums softly outside your window, or in a quiet home where the only sound is the low rhythm of your own breathing, consider how remarkable it is that a structure carved from bedrock continues to stir debate in the modern age. We are scattered across continents and time zones, yet connected by this shared curiosity about what might lie hidden beneath one of the oldest monuments still standing. If you find this exploration calming, intriguing, or simply a gentle companion to the end of your day, I would be grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of history reach others who may enjoy wandering slowly through the past. Now, let us lower our voices a little and begin tracing the path beneath the stone. The Great Sphinx stands on the Giza Plateau near the pyramids, attributed to Khufu, Khafra and Menkaure. Carved directly from the limestone bedrock, it stretches roughly 73 metres in length and rises about 20 metres high. Its body is leonine, its head human, and its expression, though weathered and partially restored, remains composed. For centuries, it has endured wind, sand, excavation, restoration, and the steady curiosity of scholars and visitors. What is less visible is that the Sphinx is not built from neatly stacked blocks alone. It was carved from a natural outcrop of limestone, which means that beneath and around it the geological layers are uneven, varied, and sometimes fractured. The plateau itself is composed of sedimentary rock laid down millions of years ago when the region was under shallow seas. Over time, those layers hardened into limestone of differing densities. Some layers are strong and compact, others are softer, more vulnerable to erosion, and more likely to contain natural fissures or cavities. From the earliest modern excavations in the 19th century, explorers noticed that the Sphinx was not a completely solid figure. There were cracks, small shafts, and openings in various parts of the body. Some appeared to be ancient repair works. Others were likely later intrusions made by treasure hunters or curious excavators. As sand was cleared away repeatedly over the years, additional features were revealed, including tunnels and passages that had been cut into the rock. One of the earliest documented tunnels was discovered at the rear of the Sphinx. A vertical shaft had been dug into the bedrock behind the monument, descending downward before meeting a horizontal passage. This shaft is often referred to as the Perring Shaft, named after the British engineer Howard Vyse and his assistant John Perring, who conducted excavations in the 1830s. The purpose of the shaft was not entirely clear. It may have been an exploratory trench. It may have been an attempt to search for hidden chambers. It was not part of the original ancient construction, but it did reveal that the bedrock beneath the Sphinx was accessible and capable of being cut into. Later investigations uncovered additional cavities. In the 1920s and 1930s, as more systematic excavations took place under the direction of Emile Barrès, French engineers and archaeologists worked to clear the Sphinx entirely from the surrounding sand. During this process, they documented a number of cracks and small voids within the body. Some were natural geological features, others appeared to have been enlarged or shaped by human intervention. The notion that large hidden chambers might lie beneath the Sphinx gained particular momentum in the 20th century. Part of this was due to the natural human tendency to imagine that monumental architecture conceals something equally monumental below. Another part came from a combination of alternative historical theories and emerging geophysical technology that allowed researchers to probe underground without digging. In the late 20th century, seismic surveys were conducted around the Sphinx. Seismic testing works by sending sound waves into the ground and measuring how they bounce back. Variations in the return signal can indicate differences in density, suggesting solid rock in some areas and possible voids in others. In the 1970s and again in the 1990s, teams of researchers performed such tests around the Sphinx enclosure. The results indicated that beneath parts of the monument and its surrounding enclosure, there were anomalies. These anomalies were consistent with natural fissures, weathered zones, and small cavities in the limestone. The limestone layers beneath the Sphinx are not uniform. Some are harder, some softer, and over thousands of years, groundwater and natural processes could have created pockets or voids. What seismic surveys did not reveal was a grand hall, a vast library, or an immense hidden chamber of constructed stone. Even so, the data showed that the subsurface was not entirely homogeneous. There were indeed areas beneath the Sphinx and its enclosure that differed from the surrounding rock. This was not entirely surprising to geologists, but it was enough to sustain interest and speculation. When ground-penetrating radar was later introduced, it provided additional data. Radar waves sent into the ground can reflect off buried objects or cavities, creating a kind of underground map. Ground-penetrating radar surveys around the Sphinx detected zones that could represent small cavities or changes in the rock. However, interpreting such data is complex. A radar anomaly does not automatically mean a man-made chamber. It could indicate a crack, a weathered pocket, or a difference in moisture content. Archaeologists tend to approach such results with caution, preferring excavation and direct observation before drawing strong conclusions. There is, however, one area of the Sphinx that is undeniably hollow in a limited sense. A small chamber exists within the body itself, accessible through a man-made opening. This chamber does not extend far and appears to have been created during earlier explorations. It does not contain inscriptions, artifacts, or evidence of a hidden archive. It is a modest cavity within the stone, more a curiosity than a revelation. Another notable feature is a rectangular cavity located on the north side of the Sphinx's body. This cavity has been studied and documented. It appears to be a later intrusion, possibly cut during earlier periods of excavation or restoration. Again, it does not lead to an extensive network of rooms. It is a limited void within the structure. The geology of the Giza Plateau itself suggests that natural cavities are possible. Limestone, especially when exposed to water over long periods, can develop karst features such as small caves or pockets. While the plateau is largely arid today, in earlier geological periods groundwater movement could have shaped the subsurface. Some researchers have proposed that small natural caves might have existed before the Sphinx was carved, and that the ancient builders may have encountered or even incorporated them during construction. The idea that the Sphinx might conceal a vast hidden library, sometimes referred to as a hall of records, is not supported by mainstream archaeological evidence. That concept largely emerged from 20th century interpretations and spiritual claims rather than from physical excavation data. Archaeologists working at Giza have consistently stated that no large constructed chambers have been found beneath the Sphinx. Nevertheless, the presence of smaller cavities and anomalies means the question has never fully disappeared. Modern Egyptian authorities have occasionally restricted excavation directly beneath the monument in order to preserve its structural stability. The Sphinx has undergone numerous restoration campaigns, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries, aimed at stabilising its weathered layers and preventing further erosion. Large-scale intrusive digging beneath it would pose risks. As a result, much of what we know about the subsurface comes from non-invasive techniques. These methods are improving over time. Advances in imaging technology, data analysis, and geological modelling continue to refine our understanding of what lies below. So far, the evidence points toward natural fissures and limited cavities rather than monumental hidden rooms. Yet the idea persists. There is something about the Sphinx that invites speculation. Perhaps it is the monument's expression, which appears both observant and reserved. Perhaps it is the sheer age of the structure, dating back to the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, around 2500 BCE. When confronted with something that has endured for over 4 millennia, it is easy to imagine that it might still be keeping secrets. The ancient Egyptians themselves did carve internal chambers into some of their monuments, particularly within pyramids and tombs. Those structures were deliberately designed with corridors and rooms. The Sphinx, by contrast, was carved from a single mass of rock and does not display architectural features consistent with a concealed chamber complex. Its function appears to have been symbolic and ceremonial rather than funerary. Still, the bedrock beneath the plateau has a history that predates the monument by millions of years. The Sphinx rests on a geological story far older than human civilization. That story includes shifting seas, sediment deposition, tectonic stability, and erosion. When seismic waves travel through that rock and return with irregular patterns, they're often revealing nature's architecture rather than human construction. Over the years, teams have mapped the enclosure around the Sphinx, identifying zones of softer limestone that have eroded more heavily than adjacent layers. Some of the vertical fissures visible on the Sphinx's body are natural fractures. Others may have been widened during antiquity for stabilization or ritual purposes. Small tunnels and shafts documented in earlier centuries have been examined and found to be either exploratory or minor. So, what was found beneath the Sphinx? The measured answer is modest. Small cavities, geological anomalies, man-made shafts from modern exploration, limited chambers carved during excavation. No vast archive, no extensive labyrinth, no monumental hidden hall. And yet, the conversation continues because the Sphinx continues to stand. Technology continues to evolve, and the limestone beneath the plateau still carries subtle variations that invite careful listening. As we move forward, it becomes important to look more closely at how those seismic surveys were conducted, what exactly they revealed, and why interpretations have varied, because understanding the methods helps illuminate the findings without exaggeration or dismissal. And from there, the story of hidden chambers becomes less about fantasy and more about how science approaches the unknown beneath ancient stone. For thousands of years, the Great Sphinx has sat at the edge of the Giza Plateau, facing east toward the rising sun, its gaze fixed somewhere beyond the modern skyline of Cairo. It is one of the most photographed, studied, restored, debated, and quietly endured monuments on Earth. And yet, for something so visible, so exposed, and so widely discussed, our understanding of it rests on a combination of solid archaeology, reasonable inference, and a handful of enduring uncertainties. Most visitors encounter the Sphinx as part of a familiar visual trio. The pyramids rise in the background, angular and geometric. The Sphinx lies before them, curved and organic, a fusion of lion's body and human head carved directly from the bedrock. It is usually introduced as a guardian figure, often attributed to Pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty, built around 2500 BCE during Egypt's Old Kingdom. That is the standard narrative, repeated in guidebooks and museum placards, and supported by a body of archaeological evidence that connects the monument to the pyramid complex nearby. The Sphinx is not a constructed statue assembled from blocks in the way the pyramids were built. It was carved from a natural limestone outcrop that protruded from the plateau. Workers cut trenches around the rock mass, isolating it, and then shaped the remaining stone into the form we recognise today. The body stretches roughly 73 metres from paw to tail. The head rises about 20 metres above the surrounding enclosure floor. The proportions are monumental, but they are not mathematically perfect. The head appears somewhat small relative to the body, a detail that has fueled discussion about possible recarving in later periods, though mainstream scholarship maintains that the head was always intended as part of the same design. The face, though eroded, retains identifiable features. The nose is missing, lost long ago, likely due to deliberate defacement rather than natural wear. The beard fragments found in earlier excavations suggest that the Sphinx once wore a ceremonial beard, later displayed in museums. The headdress resembles the nemes worn by pharaohs. The overall style aligns with Old Kingdom royal iconography, particularly that associated with Khafre, whose pyramid complex lies directly behind the monument. The enclosure surrounding the Sphinx is cut deep into the bedrock. Its walls show layers of limestone with varying degrees of erosion. Some sections appear more weathered than others. This uneven weathering has been central to debates about the monument's age, with some researchers arguing that the pattern suggests exposure to heavy rainfall long before the generally accepted Old Kingdom date. However, the prevailing archaeological consensus maintains the Fourth Dynasty attribution, citing stylistic consistency, quarry marks, and alignment with the nearby temple complex. The Sphinx temple, located directly in front of the monument, is built from large limestone blocks quarried from the enclosure itself. These blocks were arranged into a megalithic structure featuring massive pillars and carefully fitted stonework. The temple's design closely resembles that of the Valley Temple associated with Khafre. The spatial relationship between the pyramid, the causeway, the Valley Temple, the Sphinx Temple, and the Sphinx itself forms a cohesive architectural plan. This integrated layout strengthens the argument that the Sphinx was conceived as part of Khafre's mortuary complex, rather than as a structure from an earlier lost civilization. Over centuries, sand repeatedly buried the Sphinx up to its neck. Ancient Egyptians themselves undertook restoration efforts. The dream stele, placed between the Sphinx's paws during the reign of Thutmose IV in the New Kingdom, records a story in which the young prince, resting in the shadow of the Sphinx, dreams that the monument promises him kingship if he clears away the sand. The stele suggest that even in antiquity, the Sphinx was already ancient, already partially buried, already requiring maintenance. This cycle of burial and excavation shaped how later civilizations encountered the monument. Greek and Roman travellers wrote about it. Medieval chroniclers described it. By the time European explorers arrived in the 19th century, the Sphinx was again largely submerged in sand. Systematic clearing efforts revealed the full body, exposing not only the carved form, but also the geological complexity of the enclosure walls. The limestone from which the Sphinx was carved belongs to the Macadam Formation, a sedimentary deposit dating back millions of years. These layers vary in hardness. The lower layers, forming much of the body, are softer and more susceptible to erosion. The upper layers, including much of the head, are more resistant. This difference partly explains why the body appears more weathered than the face. It is not necessarily a sign of different construction periods, but rather a reflection of geological variation. When people speak of hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx, it is important first to understand what the Sphinx is and how it was created. It is not a hollow structure built atop a foundation. It is a sculpted remnant of a larger rock mass. Any cavities beneath it would have to exist within the bedrock itself, either as natural voids formed over geological time or as spaces intentionally cut by human hands. The enclosure floor around the Sphinx shows evidence of quarrying. Large blocks removed from this area were used in the construction of nearby temples. Tool marks have been identified on some surfaces. The ancient workers shaped the lion's body with considerable skill, following the contours of the available stone. They reinforced weaker sections with added masonry in certain areas. Later restorations during the New Kingdom and modern periods added further blocks to stabilize deteriorating portions. Modern archaeological study of the Sphinx has involved detailed mapping, structural analysis, and conservation planning. Engineers have examined cracks in the body and head, monitoring how environmental factors affect the stone. The monument has undergone several major restoration campaigns in the 20th century, particularly during the 1920s and again in the late 20th century under Egyptian supervision. These restorations revealed internal features that are often misinterpreted. There are small cavities within the body, some accessible through openings created during earlier excavations. These spaces are not grand chambers. They appear to be either natural pockets in the limestone or the result of exploratory digging. They do not extend far into the monument and contain no inscriptions or artifacts. The rear of the Sphinx contains a vertical shaft that descends into the bedrock. This shaft was likely dug during 19th century exploration rather than in antiquity. It intersects with a horizontal passage that extends a short distance before ending. The rock surfaces within this shaft show characteristics consistent with modern excavation techniques of that era. Archaeologists have not identified it as part of the original Old Kingdom design. Despite this, the existence of any shaft at all fuels speculation. The human imagination tends to expand small spaces into larger possibilities. A modest cavity becomes a doorway, a vertical shaft becomes a secret entrance. Over time, repeated retelling magnifies these features beyond their documented scale. Another element that contributes to the mystique is the sheer age of the Sphinx. At roughly 4,500 years old, it predates most monumental architecture still standing in other parts of the world. It has endured environmental change, political upheaval, and shifting cultural interpretations. Its survival lends it an aura of endurance that invites deeper questions. If it has lasted this long, what else might it conceal? Yet the archaeological record emphasizes continuity rather than concealment. Excavations around the Sphinx have uncovered worker settlements, tools, and evidence of organized labor. These findings reinforce the understanding that the monument was built by skilled Egyptian craftsmen during the Old Kingdom, not by unknown predecessors or advanced lost societies. The infrastructure required to carve such a monument is consistent with what is known about 4th Dynasty engineering capabilities. The Sphinx's alignment also fits within the symbolic framework of ancient Egyptian cosmology. Facing east, it greets the rising sun. The lion form is associated with strength and guardianship. The human head represents royal authority. Together they form a protective presence for the pyramid complex behind it. There is no textual evidence from ancient Egyptian sources describing hidden libraries beneath the monument. Temple inscriptions, funerary texts, and administrative records from the Old Kingdom do not mention underground chambers associated with the Sphinx. Understanding the Sphinx as part of a broader architectural and religious landscape helps ground the discussion of what lies beneath it. The plateau is not a blank canvas. It is a carefully organised necropolis with defined pathways, temples, and tombs. Subsurface features would need to fit within that context. Geophysical surveys conducted in recent decades have identified variations in subsurface density around the Sphinx enclosure. These variations are consistent with natural fissures, weathered zones, and differences in rock composition. Limestone formations often contain cracks formed by tectonic stress, or by the expansion and contraction of the rock over long periods. Water infiltration in ancient times could have widened some of these fractures. Such natural cavities do not necessarily indicate intentional construction. They are part of the geological character of the plateau. Archaeologists interpret these anomalies cautiously, distinguishing between potential man-made structures and naturally occurring voids. So far, direct evidence for extensive constructed chambers beneath the Sphinx has not been found. This does not mean the monument holds no mysteries. Its erosion patterns, restoration history, and symbolic meaning continue to be studied. Researchers analyse microfractures in the stone. They measure the impact of pollution and groundwater. They compare historical photographs to assess changes over time. Each layer of investigation adds detail to our understanding. What we think we know about the Sphinx is built on accumulated data. It was carved during the 4th dynasty, likely under Khafre. It served as part of a mortuary complex. It was periodically buried and restored. It contains small internal cavities related to geological features and later exploration. It does not, based on current evidence, conceal vast constructed chambers. Even so, the presence of those small cavities and the geological variability beneath the enclosure set the stage for further examination. When modern technology began probing beneath the surface, researchers approached the monument not as a hollow statue hiding treasure, but as a geological formation integrated with human craftsmanship. Listening to the rock through seismic waves and radar signals became the next step in clarifying what was solid and what might be void. As we move from the monument and we see to the stone we cannot see, it becomes necessary to examine how those surveys were conducted and what they actually revealed in measurable terms, because understanding the methods used to listen beneath the Sphinx helps separate documented findings from expanding legend, and the distinction between the two becomes clearer once the science itself is laid out carefully and without embellishment. Long before seismic equipment hummed quietly across the Giza Plateau and ground-penetrating radar traced invisible lines through stone, there were simpler tools at work beneath the Sphinx. There were chisels, lanterns, notebooks, and above all, curiosity. The earliest whispers of hollow spaces beneath the monument did not come from digital scans or geological modelling. They came from the sound of metal striking limestone and the echo that followed. When 19th century explorers began clearing the sand from around the Sphinx in earnest, they were not operating with the careful preservation standards of modern archaeology. Many were driven by a mixture of scholarly interest and the hope of discovery. Egypt had already yielded temples, tombs, and pyramids. It was not unreasonable in their view to suspect that something might lie hidden beneath the most enigmatic statue of all. As sand was removed from the enclosure, workers encountered cracks and fissures in the exposed bedrock. Some were narrow, hairline fractures typical of sedimentary rock. Others were wider gaps where softer layers had eroded more deeply. To an experienced geologist, such features were expected. Limestone forms in layers, and those layers do not always weather evenly. To an eager explorer holding a torch in the half-light of a trench, however, a shadowed fissure could look like an entrance. Reports from the 1830s and 1840s described small shafts and openings discovered around the Sphinx. Some were deliberately cut by explorers themselves, probing the rock in search of chambers. Others appear to have predated those efforts, though whether they were ancient or more recent remains debated. The most frequently cited early shaft is located at the rear of the Sphinx's body. This vertical passage descends into the bedrock and connects to a short horizontal corridor. It is commonly attributed to the work of John Perring, who assisted Colonel Richard Howard Vyse during excavations at Giza. The shaft does not resemble a finished ancient corridor. Its walls are rough, its dimensions are modest. It does not lead to a decorated chamber or concealed doorway. It ends after a short distance. Modern assessments conclude that it was likely dug as an exploratory effort rather than as part of the original monument. Yet once such a shaft exists, it becomes part of the story. It suggests access. It suggests depth. It suggests the possibility that more might lie beyond what has been reached. During Emile Barréz's extensive clearing operations in the 1920s, additional cavities were documented within the Sphinx's body and along the enclosure walls. Barrés approached the monument with a focus on stabilisation. He reinforced weakened sections with masonry blocks and repaired areas where erosion had hollowed out softer layers. In doing so, he exposed pockets within the limestone that had formed naturally over time. These cavities were not large halls. They were irregular voids where the stone had weathered away. Some extended inward a short distance before tapering off. Limestone, particularly in arid regions that once experienced wetter climates, can develop such features through chemical dissolution. Water seeping into cracks slowly dissolves calcium carbonate. enlarging fissures into pockets. Over centuries or millennia, small voids form. When sand is cleared and the rock face exposed, these voids become visible. Accounts from workers and visitors sometimes described hearing differences in sound when tapping certain areas of the enclosure walls. A solid section of limestone produces a dense, muted tone. A section with a cavity behind it can produce a slightly hollow resonance. In an era before geophysical instruments, such auditory cues were interpreted as potential indicators of hidden rooms. The idea that the Sphinx might conceal something within the plateau gained momentum through repetition rather than through confirmed excavation. Travel literature from the late 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally mentioned rumours of tunnels beneath the monument. These accounts often lacked precise measurements or documentation. They relied on anecdote. A guide might point toward a crack and suggest that it extended deep below. A visitor might write of a local story describing hidden passages. Over time, these fragments accumulated into a broader narrative of mystery. It is important to consider the context of Egyptology during this period. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 had demonstrated that sealed spaces could remain undisturbed for millennia. The pyramids themselves contained internal corridors and chambers, some of which had been unknown until relatively modern exploration. Against that backdrop, the notion that the Sphinx might also conceal something significant did not seem implausible. However, the structural difference between a pyramid and the Sphinx is substantial. Pyramids were constructed with internal architecture deliberately designed to house burial chambers. The Sphinx was carved from a single mass of rock. Any internal chamber would require cutting inward from the exterior, compromising structural integrity. The monument's original design shows no clear architectural evidence of such an undertaking. Even so, early observers noted that the bedrock beneath the Sphinx was not uniform. The enclosure walls display alternating layers of harder and softer limestone. In some places, the softer layers have receded more deeply, creating overhangs and irregular surfaces. To someone standing within the enclosure, these features can resemble partially collapsed cavities. The human mind, particularly when primed for discovery, tends to extend such irregularities into imagined networks. By the mid-20th century, whispers of hollow spaces had become intertwined with broader alternative theories about ancient civilizations. Writers outside mainstream archaeology began proposing that the Sphinx predated the Fourth Dynasty by thousands of years. If it were older, they argued, it might belong to a lost culture with advanced knowledge. And if such a culture existed, perhaps it left records hidden beneath the monument. These ideas did not originate from excavation data. They grew from reinterpretations of erosion patterns and from speculative readings of ancient myths. Yet once the concept of hidden chambers entered popular imagination, every documented fissure or cavity seemed to support it. Seismologists and geophysicists in the latter half of the 20th century sought to replace speculation with measurement. Before their surveys began, however, the groundwork of rumour had already been laid. Local guides sometimes spoke of underground passages. Photographs of small openings were circulated without scale references. A modest shaft could appear monumental when framed tightly. One notable cavity within the Sphinx's body is accessible through an opening on the north side. This cavity extends inward a limited distance. It does not branch extensively. Its surfaces show signs consistent with later intervention, rather than ancient design. Archaeologists interpret it as either a natural pocket that was enlarged or as a modern exploratory cut. It does not contain artifacts or inscriptions. The dream stele between the Sphinx's paws also contributed indirectly to the mystique. Its inscription recounts a dream in which the Sphinx promises kingship to Thutmose IV if he clears the sand. The stele presents the monument as a powerful, ancient presence. Later readers sometimes extrapolated from this narrative, imagining that such a powerful monument must guard something equally significant beneath it. The stele itself makes no such claim, but symbolism often outpaces literal content. During restoration work in the 20th century, engineers occasionally encountered voids within deteriorated layers of the body. These voids were typically shallow and irregular. Conservation teams filled them with stabilizing materials to prevent collapse. Each documented cavity was measured and recorded. None extended into large constructed spaces. The geology of the Giza Plateau remains central to understanding these early rumours. Limestone formations often contain bedding planes, joints and fractures. Over geological time, these features can become pathways for water. In climates that fluctuate between wet and dry conditions, chemical weathering can enlarge them. Although modern Giza is arid, the region experienced different climatic phases in distant prehistory. Some natural voids may predate human occupation of the plateau entirely. When explorers first noticed hollow-sounding areas or visible cracks, they were encountering the natural architecture of sedimentary rock. Without modern imaging tools, it was difficult to determine the extent of those features without invasive digging. Some chose to dig, others documented and left them intact. In either case, the perception of hidden depth became part of the monument's evolving narrative. By the time systematic geophysical surveys began in the 1970s, the idea that the Sphinx might conceal hidden chambers had already circulated widely. Researchers approached the site aware of these claims. Their goal was to test them objectively. Seismic equipment was set up to send controlled vibrations into the ground. Sensors recorded how those waves travelled and reflected. Variations in velocity could indicate differences in density, including potential voids. The results did show anomalies. Beneath parts of the enclosure and adjacent to the Sphinx, zones of differing density were detected. These zones were interpreted as natural fissures or weathered areas, rather than as large constructed rooms. The anomalies were relatively small and irregular. They did not outline symmetrical chambers or corridors. Yet the language of scientific reporting, describing subsurface anomalies or low-velocity zones, can be misread outside its technical context. An anomaly in geophysical terms simply means a variation from surrounding material. It does not imply a hidden hall. Nonetheless, headlines and secondary accounts sometimes amplified these findings into something more dramatic. The early whispers in the limestone began with echoes and shadows. They continued with exploratory shafts and documented cavities. They expanded through speculative interpretation. By the time modern instruments began to listen systematically to the stone, the narrative of hidden chambers was already firmly embedded in public imagination. Understanding this progression clarifies why the question persists. It did not arise from a single discovery. It accumulated gradually, layer by layer, much like the limestone itself. Small voids were real, shafts were real, geological variability was real. The leap from those features to expansive hidden archives was not supported by excavation, but the leap occurred in storytelling rather than in stone. As technology improved, attention shifted from tapping and torchlight to radar imaging and digital modelling. The next phase of investigation moved from rumour to data, from hollow echoes to measurable reflections. To appreciate what those later surveys revealed, it becomes necessary to look closely at how science listened to the rock, and how those measured echoes differed from the earlier whispers that first stirred curiosity beneath the Sphinx. By the time the 20th century reached its latter decades, the conversation about hidden spaces beneath the Sphinx had grown loud enough that simple visual inspection was no longer sufficient. Archaeologists had cleared the sand, documented visible cavities, and examined shafts dug during earlier explorations. What remained uncertain was what lay deeper in the bedrock, beyond the reach of lantern light and hand tools. Rather than cutting further into the monument and risking damage, researchers turned to methods that allowed them to listen to the stone instead of breaking it. Seismology, the science most commonly associated with earthquakes, became one of the tools applied to the Giza Plateau. The principle is straightforward. When a vibration travels through solid rock, it moves at a measurable speed. If that vibration encounters a boundary between materials of different density, such as solid limestone and an air-filled cavity, its behaviour changes. It may slow down, reflect, refract, or scatter. By generating controlled vibrations and recording how they move through the ground, scientists can infer what lies beneath the surface. In the 1970s, researchers began conducting seismic refraction surveys around the Sphinx enclosure. Equipment was placed at measured intervals across the plateau. Small, controlled energy sources produced vibrations that travelled through the subsurface layers. Geophones recorded the arrival times of those waves at various distances. From these data points, scientists calculated the velocity of the waves in different zones. Solid, dense limestone allows seismic waves to travel relatively quickly. Fractured or weathered rock slows them down. An air-filled cavity would produce a marked contrast. The resulting measurements revealed that the bedrock beneath the Sphinx and its enclosure was not uniform. There were areas where wave velocities decreased, suggesting zones of softer or more fractured material. These findings were not unexpected. The Sphinx was carved from sedimentary limestone deposited in layers millions of years ago. Sedimentary rock naturally contains bedding planes, joints, and variations in density. Over geological time, stress, erosion, and chemical processes create irregularities. A seismic anomaly in such a formation does not automatically indicate a constructed chamber. It indicates a difference from surrounding rock. Still, the presence of measurable anomalies beneath one of the world's most iconic monuments drew attention. Researchers carefully mapped the zones where wave speeds differed. Some anomalies appeared near the base of the Sphinx's paws. Others were detected along the enclosure walls. None of them outlined large rectangular spaces. They were irregular in shape and limited in extent. During the 1990s, additional surveys were conducted using more advanced equipment. Improvements in data processing allowed for higher resolution modelling of the subsurface. Some teams combined seismic methods with electrical resistivity testing, which measures how easily electrical currents move through the ground. Dry solid limestone has different resistivity properties than moist or fractured zones. By comparing results from multiple techniques, researchers aim to reduce ambiguity. Ground-penetrating radar was also employed. This method sends electromagnetic pulses into the ground and records reflections from subsurface features. It is particularly effective at detecting shallow anomalies. Radar surveys around the Sphinx identified several areas where reflections suggested voids or density contrast within a few meters of the surface. Again, interpretation required caution. Radar reflections can result from cracks, changes in moisture content, or shifts between limestone layers of varying composition. Archaeologists and geophysicists collaborated to correlate radar data with known geological features. Where possible, limited test excavations were conducted to verify what the instrument suggested. In cases where small cavities were confirmed, they tended to match natural fissures or weathered pockets rather than constructed chambers. One anomaly detected near the north side corresponded to a shallow cavity already visible in the rock face. Another aligned with a previously documented shaft from 19th century exploration. The instruments were accurately detecting differences in density, but those differences did not amount to hidden halls. Seismic tomography, a technique that creates three-dimensional models from wave data, further refined the picture. By analysing the travel times of waves along multiple paths, scientists generated subsurface maps showing zones of relative density variation. These maps revealed a network of fractures and irregularities consistent with the plateau's geological history. The Giza Plateau's limestone belongs to the Macadam Formation, composed of alternating layers deposited in ancient marine environments. Some layers are compact and resistant, others are softer and more porous. The Sphinx itself was carved from a sequence of these layers, which explains why certain sections of the body erode faster than others. Beneath the monument, those same layers continue. Seismic results indicated that certain lower layers beneath the Sphinx were more fractured than upper ones. This could be due to natural stress patterns, historical water infiltration, or the mechanical impact of quarrying during the monument's creation. When workers cut away stone to isolate the Sphinx, they altered stress distribution in the remaining rock mass. Over centuries, microfractures may have expanded slightly, creating small voids. Some anomalies appeared to form roughly linear patterns following natural bedding planes. None displayed the symmetry typical of human-designed architecture. No long corridors or large rectangular chambers were detected in the datasets published by research teams working with Egyptian authorities. It is important to understand how scientific caution operates in such contexts. A geophysical anomaly is a clue, not a conclusion. It signals that something differs from surrounding material. Determining what that something is requires correlation with geological knowledge, historical documentation, and, when feasible, direct inspection. In the case of the Sphinx, direct intrusive excavation beneath the monument carries significant risk. The stone is already weakened in places by erosion. Removing support from below could compromise stability. Egyptian antiquities authorities have consistently prioritized preservation. Limited drilling has occasionally been conducted to sample rock properties, but large-scale excavation beneath the Sphinx has not been approved. As a result, interpretation relies heavily on non-invasive data. Some independent researchers have argued that certain anomalies warrant deeper exploration. They point to clusters of low-velocity zones and suggest they could indicate larger cavities at greater depth. However, peer-reviewed publications from the primary survey teams describe these zones as consistent with fractured limestone rather than open chambers. The language used in technical reports tends to be precise and restrained. Phrases such as subsurface heterogeneity, localized low-velocity anomalies, and weathered zones appear frequently. When these phrases enter popular discussion, they sometimes lose nuance. Heterogeneity becomes hidden void. Weathered zone becomes concealed chamber. The shift is subtle, but significant. One notable survey focused on the area between the Sphinx and the adjacent Sphinx temple. Data suggested variations in subsurface density, consistent with quarrying activity during the monument's construction. This aligns with archaeological understanding that blocks for the temple were extracted from the enclosure. Quarry trenches and backfilled areas would naturally produce seismic contrasts. Another survey extended beyond the immediate enclosure to map broader plateau features. It identified natural fissure systems running through the limestone. Such fissures are common in sedimentary formations. They can extend several meters but do not necessarily form open cavities large enough for human occupation. Throughout these investigations, no evidence of a vast underground library, archive, or constructed hall was presented in official findings. The anomalies documented were measured in meters, not tens of meters. They were irregular, not architecturally defined. Yet the act of listening to the stone carried symbolic weight. For centuries, the Sphinx had been seen as silent and inscrutable. Seismic surveys represented a literal attempt to hear what lay beneath its surface. The metaphor of listening to stone appealed to imagination. Headlines occasionally emphasized the mystery more than the measurements. From a scientific perspective, the surveys accomplished their goal. They characterized the subsurface structure without invasive excavation. They confirmed the presence of natural fractures and small cavities. They provided data useful for conservation planning, helping engineers understand stress distribution beneath the monument. They also demonstrated the limits of expectation. When sophisticated instruments probed beneath one of the world's most storied monuments, the results were geological rather than mythical. The limestone held fissures, not archives. That does not mean every square metre beneath the Sphinx has been exhaustively mapped. Geophysical surveys provide resolution within certain depth ranges and accuracy margins. Deeper anomalies are more difficult to interpret clearly. However, within the surveyed zones closest to the monument's base, the data consistently support natural explanations. The process of scientific listening transformed the conversation. Instead of relying on echoes heard by ear or shadows seen by torchlight, researchers relied on wave velocities, reflection coefficients, and three-dimensional modelling. Each dataset narrowed the range of plausible interpretations. As the instruments grew more sensitive, the narrative shifted from rumour to measured variability. What remained were small cavities and fractured zones consistent with sedimentary geology. No sealed doorways, no vast constructed rooms, no carved corridors extending beneath the lion's body. Even so, the presence of measurable anomalies kept attention focused on the subsurface. If natural fissures existed, could ancient builders have encountered them during carving? If small voids were present, might they have been enlarged for unknown purposes? These questions required examination not only of geology, but also of historical excavation records and official investigations conducted under Egyptian supervision. The next stage of inquiry would involve those official excavations, where archaeologists and engineers combined survey data with limited direct access to determine precisely what had been found beneath and within the Sphinx's stone. Before modern instruments traced subsurface patterns in digital grids, there were visible passages cut into the stone, and these became the earliest tangible focus of speculation. When people speak about tunnels beneath the Sphinx, they are often referring, at least indirectly, to a handful of documented shafts and cavities that have existed in or around the monument for over a century. These features are real. They can be photographed, measured, and entered. The question has always been whether they are remnants of an original ancient design, later additions from historic exploration, or simply natural irregularities in the limestone that were widened by human hands. The most frequently cited passage lies at the rear of the Sphinx. This vertical shaft descends into the bedrock behind the monument's body and intersects with a short horizontal corridor. Early explorers in the 19th century, particularly during the work associated with Colonel Richard Howard Weiss and his assistant John Perring in the 1830s, are generally credited with digging the shaft. Contemporary accounts describe exploratory digging in the area. The surfaces of the shaft do not display the polished finish or architectural detailing typical of Old Kingdom construction. Instead, they appear rough and utilitarian, consistent with excavation rather than deliberate monument design. The shaft extends downward several meters before reaching a horizontal segment that continues briefly and then ends. There is no chamber at the end, no carved doorway, no decorated wall. The rock surfaces show marks compatible with tools used in the 19th century. Archaeologists who have examined the shaft have concluded that it was likely an attempt by early explorers to determine whether a cavity existed beneath the Sphinx. The result was negative in terms of large hidden spaces, but the shaft itself became a lasting feature. Another known opening is located on the north side of the Sphinx's body. This entrance leads into a cavity within the monument. The cavity does not extend deeply and does not branch into a network. Its interior surfaces suggest that the space may have been enlarged or modified at some point. Whether the cavity originated as a natural pocket within the limestone or was intentionally cut remains debated, though the prevailing view is that it began as a natural feature that was later accessed. Within the body of the Sphinx itself, smaller voids have been identified during restoration work. As conservation teams removed deteriorated stone and stabilized weakened layers, they encountered pockets where softer limestone had eroded away. These voids were irregular in shape and limited in size. None resembled the kind of corridor one would design for human passage. Instead, they followed the natural bedding planes and fracture lines of the rock. Understanding the geological context is essential. The Sphinx was carved from a ridge of limestone belonging to the Macadam Formation. This formation consists of layered sediment deposited in ancient marine conditions. Over millions of years, tectonic stress and chemical weathering created joints and fissures. Some layers are more porous than others. When water infiltrates these porous layers, it can dissolve the calcium carbonate, slowly enlarging cracks into small cavities. Such features are common in limestone environments worldwide. If ancient builders encountered a natural cavity while carving the Sphinx, they would have faced a practical decision. They could fill it, incorporate it, or leave it. There is no clear evidence that large natural caves existed within the outcrop used for the monument. The carving process itself likely removed weaker sections. The remaining rock mass that forms the Sphinx today is comparatively stable, though weathered. The enclosure walls around the Sphinx provide additional clues. These walls display alternating bands of erosion. Softer layers have receded more deeply, creating uneven profiles. In some areas, recesses extend inward several centimetres or more. At a glance, these recesses can resemble the beginnings of tunnels. Close inspection reveals that they follow sedimentary layering rather than straight architectural lines. In the early 20th century, as Emil Barras directed large-scale clearing and stabilisation efforts, documentation became more systematic. Barras recorded visible cracks and cavities, distinguishing between those that were natural and those that appeared to result from human intervention. Some openings had clearly been cut deliberately during earlier excavations. Others were natural voids exposed by sand removal. One cavity beneath the Sphinx's paw area attracted attention because of its position. Located near the base of the monument, it appeared in photographs as a dark recess. Measurements taken during restoration indicated that it did not extend far beyond the visible opening. It did not connect to a deeper system. Its irregular interior suggested natural formation rather than carved symmetry. The distinction between natural caves and human design often rests on geometry. Ancient Egyptian architecture, even in its earliest monumental forms, tends toward order and alignment. Corridors are straight. Chambers are rectangular or follow deliberate curves. Walls are smoothed and in many cases inscribed. The voids found within and around the Sphinx lack these characteristics. Their shapes are uneven, their ceilings are not levelled, their dimensions vary unpredictably. The idea that the Sphinx might sit atop an extensive cave system sometimes draws from the broader geology of limestone regions, where karst landscapes develop networks of underground passages. However, the Giza Plateau does not exhibit large-scale karst features comparable to those found in regions with abundant rainfall. While small dissolution pockets occur, there is no evidence of vast subterranean caverns beneath the plateau in the immediate vicinity of the Sphinx. Explorers in the 19th century were influenced by discoveries elsewhere in Egypt. Hidden chambers had been found in pyramids and tombs. In some cases, entrances were concealed or blocked. This context encouraged probing. When an opening was found in the Sphinx, it was natural to wonder whether it led to something more substantial. The absence of such continuation did not entirely quiet speculation, but it limited confirmed findings. Some proponents of alternative historical theories have suggested that the head of the Sphinx was recarved from an earlier monument, and that tunnels beneath it belonged to a prior civilization. Archaeological evidence does not support this scenario. Tool marks on the body and enclosure correspond to Old Kingdom techniques. Quarry marks indicate that blocks removed during carving were used in nearby temples associated with Khafra's complex. During the mid-20th century, reports occasionally surfaced claiming the discovery of new tunnels. Upon investigation, these claims typically referred to known shafts or to minor fissures that had been previously documented. The repetition of such reports contributed to the perception of ongoing hidden discovery, even when the features themselves were not new. The role of restoration in shaping these perceptions should not be underestimated. As conservation teams injected mortar into cracks or replaced weakened stones with modern blocks, they sometimes temporarily opened areas that had been sealed by erosion. Photographs of workers inside cavities circulated without context, leading some observers to assume the presence of extensive chambers. In reality, these spaces were limited and part of stabilization efforts. There is also the matter of symbolic interpretation. The Sphinx has long been viewed as a guardian figure. Guardians are often imagined to protect something valuable. This symbolic association reinforces the expectation that something might lie hidden nearby. In ancient Egyptian religion, however, guardianship often related to spiritual protection rather than physical concealment of archives. One must also consider the practical challenges of constructing extensive tunnels beneath a carved monument. The Sphinx's body rests on bedrock that supports its weight. Excavating large voids beneath it would risk destabilization. Ancient builders demonstrated engineering skill, but they also understood structural limitations. There is no evidence in Old Kingdom texts or reliefs describing the creation of underground chambers associated with the Sphinx. In contrast, the pyramids were deliberately constructed with internal chambers from the outset. Their architecture accommodates such spaces. The Sphinx's form does not suggest internal architecture as part of its primary function. Its role appears ceremonial and symbolic, integrated with the temple complex before it and the pyramid behind it. Geophysical surveys discussed previously detected anomalies consistent with fractured limestone. These findings align with the presence of natural fissures rather than human-designed tunnels. Where small cavities have been accessible, inspection confirms irregular geometry. None show signs of deliberate smoothing, alignment, or decorative work typical of ancient Egyptian interior spaces. The first tunnels associated with the Sphinx, therefore, appear to belong to later exploration rather than original construction. The vertical shaft at the rear is best understood as an exploratory excavation from the 19th century. Other small openings reflect either natural geological features or limited investigative cuts. Yet the presence of any tunnel, regardless of origin, carries narrative weight. Once a passage exists, it invites extension in imagination. A short corridor becomes the suggestion of a longer one. A vertical shaft becomes the hint of a hidden entrance. Over decades, repetition amplifies the scale in retelling. Separating measured fact from layered interpretation requires attention to documentation. Excavation reports from early explorers describe their activities in practical terms. They record depths, directions, and outcomes. They do not report discovering grand chambers beneath the Sphinx. Later conservation records similarly describe limited voids encountered and stabilized. The interplay between natural geology and human curiosity created the earliest rumors of hollow spaces. Limestone provided fissures, explorers provided shafts, observers provided speculation. By the time scientific surveys added data to the conversation, the image of tunnels beneath the Sphinx was already embedded in popular thought. From this foundation of visible shafts and modest cavities, a larger narrative would emerge in the 20th century, fueled not by excavation but by prophecy and reinterpretation, introducing the idea that something far more significant might be hidden beneath the monument. And it is in that context that the story of a so-called Hall of Records would enter the discussion and reshape how these early tunnels were perceived. By the early 20th century, the discussion about possible cavities beneath the Sphinx had moved beyond chisels and geological surveys and entered a very different realm. Instead of explorers digging shafts or engineers mapping fractures, attention shifted toward prophecy, spiritual interpretation, and the idea that the monument concealed something far more dramatic than weathered limestone. At the centre of that shift was a man who never visited the Sphinx at all. Edgar Cayce was an American clairvoyant who lived from 1877 to 1945. Known as the Sleeping Prophet, he claimed to enter a trance state during which he delivered readings on health, reincarnation, ancient civilizations, and future events. His followers recorded thousands of these readings. Among them were statements concerning ancient Egypt, Atlantis, and a hidden repository of knowledge beneath the Sphinx. Cayce described what he called a Hall of Records, said to contain the preserved history of a lost advanced civilization, often identified as Atlantis. According to his readings, survivors of this civilization travelled to Egypt in remote antiquity and left behind a chamber filled with documents and artifacts recording their achievements. He placed this chamber somewhere beneath the Sphinx, or between the Sphinx and the pyramids, sealed and awaiting rediscovery. The appeal of this idea was immediate and powerful. It offered a narrative far grander than modest fissures or exploratory shafts. Instead of natural cavities, there was the promise of a library. Instead of fractured limestone, there were imagined scrolls, instruments, and evidence of forgotten technology. The Sphinx, already ancient and enigmatic, became in this story a guardian of knowledge predating Egypt itself. It is important to understand the cultural context in which Cayce's claims gained traction. The early 20th century was a period of intense fascination with Egypt. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 fueled global interest in ancient mysteries. Simultaneously, spiritualist movements were popular in Europe and North America. Seances, trance readings, and alternative interpretations of history found receptive audiences. Cayce's descriptions were not based on excavation reports or geological analysis. They were delivered during trance sessions and recorded by stenographers. In several readings during the 1930s, he gave details about the supposed location of the Hall of Records, specifying that it would be found beneath the right forepaw of the Sphinx, and that it would be entered through a passage from the Great Pyramid. These claims stood in contrast to established archaeological understanding. Excavations beneath the Sphinx had not revealed such a chamber. No passage from the Great Pyramid to the Sphinx had been identified. The layout of Khafra's pyramid complex showed no structural alignment consistent with such a tunnel. Nevertheless, the specificity of Cayce's statements made them compelling to his followers. The Edgar Cayce Foundation, later known as the Association for Research and Enlightenment, preserved and promoted his readings. Over time, interest in verifying his predictions grew. By the latter half of the 20th century, some researchers sympathetic to Cayce's ideas began advocating for scientific surveys of the Giza Plateau to test the possibility of hidden chambers. This convergence of prophecy and technology created a curious dynamic. When seismic and radar surveys in the 1970s and 1990s detected subsurface anomalies, supporters of the Hall of Records theory interpreted them as confirmation. In their view, any anomaly beneath the Sphinx could correspond to Cayce's chamber. In scientific terms, however, anomalies indicated density variation, not necessarily constructed rooms. Egyptian antiquities authorities remained skeptical of Cayce's claims. Official archaeological positions emphasized evidence-based investigation. While geophysical surveys were conducted for conservation and research purposes, there was no endorsement of the Hall of Records narrative within academic Egyptology. The persistence of Cayce's prophecy illustrates how powerful narrative can be when attached to a monument already rich in symbolism. The Sphinx's silence lends itself to projection. A story of hidden knowledge resonates because it aligns with the broader theme of ancient wisdom lost to time. The monument's age makes it plausible in imagination that it might conceal something older still. In evaluating Cayce's statements, it is essential to distinguish between spiritual belief and empirical evidence. No physical excavation beneath the Sphinx has uncovered a chamber matching his description. No artifacts linked to a lost Atlantean civilization have been found in the vicinity. The known shafts and cavities do not correspond to the scale or orientation described in his readings. Nevertheless, the Hall of Records concept influenced public perception significantly. Documentaries, books, and lectures throughout the late 20th century revisited Cayce's claims. Some presented them as intriguing possibilities, others treated them as suppressed truths. In many cases, the existence of minor subsurface anomalies was cited as indirect support. One factor contributing to the endurance of this narrative is the limited accessibility of the Sphinx site. Excavation beneath the monument is tightly controlled. Conservation concerns limit intrusive work. This restriction, though practical and necessary, can appear to some as secrecy. When access is limited, speculation often fills the gap. It is also worth noting that ancient Egyptian texts themselves do not mention a hidden archive beneath the Sphinx. The dream stele between its paws describes a royal vision, but makes no reference to concealed chambers. Temple inscriptions from the Old and New Kingdoms focus on ritual, kingship, and offerings. they do not hint at a subterranean repository of records. From a geological perspective, large constructed chambers beneath the Sphinx would likely produce clear signatures in seismic and radar data. The surveys conducted thus far have not revealed such features. The anomalies detected are consistent with fractured limestone layers rather than extensive hollow spaces. Despite this, the Hall of Records remains part of popular discussion. It has been referenced in television programs, speculative books, and online forums. The narrative blends Atlantis, ancient wisdom, and the mystique of Egypt into a single story. For some, it represents hope that definitive answers about humanity's distant past remain hidden and waiting. The endurance of Cayce's prophecy demonstrates how the conversation about the Sphinx evolved from physical exploration to metaphysical expectation. Early rumours of hollow spaces were grounded in visible shafts and natural cavities. The Hall of Records expanded that foundation into a vision of concealed archives and forgotten civilizations. In academic contexts, the prophecy is generally treated as a cultural phenomenon rather than as an archaeological lead. Scholars acknowledge its influence on public interest, but rely on measurable evidence. The distinction between belief and data remains central, yet the interaction between Cayce's claims and subsequent scientific surveys created a lasting association. When geophysicists mapped anomalies beneath the Sphinx, headlines sometimes frame the findings in light of the Hall of Records. Even when official reports described natural features, the link persisted in public imagination. The story of Edgar Cayce and the Hall of Records marks a turning point in how hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx were perceived. It shifted attention from modest tunnels and geological pockets to the possibility of a grand concealed library. Whether viewed as prophecy, myth, or cultural artifact, it reshaped the narrative landscape around the monument. As scientific investigation continued, archaeologists found themselves addressing not only physical features, but also expectations shaped by decades of speculative storytelling. The need to clarify what had been actually discovered beneath the Sphinx became more pressing, particularly when official excavations were conducted under Egyptian authority, aiming to document findings in measured detail and to separate observable reality from enduring legend. By the time prophecy, speculation, and measured geophysical surveys had all entered the conversation, the Sphinx stood at the centre of two parallel narratives. One was built on excavation reports, stratigraphy, tool marks, and geological data. The other was built on interpretation, symbolism, and the enduring appeal of hidden knowledge. Both narratives drew from the same monument, yet they operated under very different rules. Archaeology, at its core, depends on physical evidence. It asks what can be measured, documented, dated, and compared. When archaeologists examine a structure like the Sphinx, they consider quarry marks, alignment with surrounding architecture, pottery fragments found in nearby worker settlements, and the chemical composition of mortar used in restoration phases. They analyse erosion patterns in relation to known climatic shifts. They review inscriptions that connect monuments to specific rulers. Legend operates differently. It draws strength from suggestion and resonance rather than from stratified layers of soil. A legend does not require a carved doorway to imagine a chamber. It does not require a corridor to picture a hidden archive. It thrives in absence as much as in presence. When applied to a monument as imposing as the Sphinx, legend finds ample room. The tension between these approaches became more visible in the late 20th century, as geophysical surveys detected subsurface anomalies consistent with fractured limestone. Some interpreted those findings conservatively. Others interpreted them expansively. A zone of low seismic velocity became, in some accounts, confirmation of a concealed hall. Official reports describing natural fissures were read by alternative writers as cautious wording masking something more dramatic. Egyptian antiquities authorities, responsible for the preservation of the Giza Plateau, maintained a clear position. Excavations and surveys were conducted under supervision, and findings were documented in technical publications. When limited cavities were found, they were described in measured terms. When shafts were identified as modern exploratory cuts, that assessment was recorded. No official excavation uncovered a chamber corresponding to the Hall of Records narrative. Part of drawing a line between archaeology and legend involves understanding how evidence accumulates. In archaeology, a single anomaly does not stand alone. It is weighed against context. If a cavity is detected beneath a monument, researchers ask whether it aligns with known construction practices. They consider whether similar features appear elsewhere in the same geological formation. They test whether the anomaly persists across different survey methods. At Giza, the broader context is well studied. The pyramid complexes of the 4th dynasty show deliberate architectural planning. Worker villages have been excavated. Tools, bread ovens, and administrative seals have been found. The Sphinx fits within this network. Its enclosure provided limestone blocks used in adjacent temples. The alignment of its axis corresponds with the orientation of Khafra's complex. These connections reinforce its Old Kingdom origin. Legends, by contrast, often detach the Sphinx from this context. In speculative narratives, it becomes an isolated relic of a lost civilization or a guardian of pre-dynastic knowledge. Such narratives frequently rely on reinterpretations of erosion patterns or symbolic associations. They rarely incorporate the full body of archaeological data from the plateau. One reason legends persist is that archaeology is incremental. It advances through careful excavation and cautious publication. Its conclusions are often provisional, open to revision with new evidence. Legend offers immediacy. It provides a complete story, a dramatic revelation waiting beneath the sand. For many, that story feels more satisfying than a report describing irregular limestone layers. Another factor is accessibility. Technical publications are not always widely read outside academic circles. When survey results are summarized in media reports, nuance can be lost. A headline might announce "chambers detected beneath Sphinx," without clarifying that the chambers in question are small natural cavities measured in meters, not grand halls. The phrase "drawing the line in the sand" is fitting in this context. The Giza Plateau is literally sand-covered terrain, repeatedly buried and uncovered. Metaphorically, it represents the boundary between measured evidence and imaginative extension. Archaeology draws its line by specifying what has been found and what has not. Legend often steps across that line without hesitation. It is also necessary to acknowledge that archaeology itself once operated with fewer safeguards. Early explorers dug shafts without comprehensive documentation. Some areas of the plateau were disturbed before systematic methods were standard. This historical legacy sometimes complicates interpretation. When a shaft exists and its exact date is uncertain, room opens for speculation. Modern reassessment, however, has clarified that most accessible tunnels near the Sphinx correspond to known 19th century explorations. The role of conservation further reinforces archaeological caution. The Sphinx has suffered significant erosion. Restoration efforts aim to stabilize weakened layers and prevent further deterioration. Large-scale excavation beneath the monument would pose structural risks. Authorities prioritize preservation over exploration driven by unverified claims. This policy sometimes appears restrictive to those hoping for dramatic discovery, but it reflects an obligation to protect the monument. Legends also draw power from secrecy. Restricted access to certain areas of the plateau can be interpreted as concealment. In reality, restrictions often relate to conservation, safety, and the logistical challenges of managing a heavily visited site. The perception of hidden knowledge can flourish when direct access is limited. When evaluating claims of hidden chambers, archaeologists rely on cumulative data. They compare findings from multiple independent surveys. If a large constructed room existed beneath the Sphinx, it would likely produce consistent signatures across seismic, radar, and resistivity methods. It would also align with architectural features detectable through drilling or limited core sampling. No such consistent evidence has emerged in peer-reviewed studies. That does not mean archaeology dismisses anomalies outright. Each irregularity is examined. In some cases, minor cavities have been documented and stabilised. In others, features correspond to quarry activity or natural fractures. The key distinction lies in scale and structure. Natural features lack the geometric regularity and cultural markers associated with deliberate construction. Legends, on the other hand, can operate independently of scale. A small cavity can symbolise a grand secret. A minor anomaly can stand in for an entire lost civilization. The Sphinx's enduring mystery provides fertile ground for such symbolism. Drawing the line between archaeology and legend does not require dismissing curiosity. Curiosity drives both disciplines. The difference lies in method. Archaeology asks how we know. It demands reproducible evidence. It revises conclusions when new data appear. Legend asks what if. It extends beyond evidence into possibility. At Giza, the line has been drawn repeatedly through measured investigation. Official excavations beneath and around the Sphinx have not uncovered extensive constructed chambers. Geophysical surveys indicate natural geological variability. Documented shafts correspond to modern exploration rather than ancient design. These findings form the archaeological baseline, yet public fascination with hidden chambers persists. It is reinforced by cultural narratives about lost knowledge and ancient wisdom. It is amplified by media portrayals that emphasize mystery over measurement. The Sphinx's expression, carved in stone, offers no clarification. It remains unchanged whether viewed through the lens of geology or prophecy. Understanding where archaeology ends and legend begins allows for appreciation of both without confusion. The Sphinx can be admired as a monumental achievement of Old Kingdom engineering, while acknowledging that its subsurface holds natural fissures rather than concealed libraries. The monument's significance does not depend on hidden archives. Its presence alone is extraordinary. As the discussion continues, attention turns towards specific official investigations conducted under Egyptian supervision in the late 20th century. When archaeologists combined survey data with controlled excavation to document precisely what had been found beneath the monument's base, clarifying in concrete terms which spaces were real and how far they extended within the limestone. At the back of the Sphinx, where the lion's tail curves along the limestone ridge and the enclosure opens toward the desert beyond, there is a feature that has drawn steady attention for nearly 2 centuries. It is not large. It is not ornate. It does not resemble the carefully planned corridors inside a pyramid. Yet, it exists, cut downward into the rock, and because it exists, it has carried more narrative weight than its dimensions might suggest. This feature is commonly referred to as the rear shaft. It descends vertically into the bedrock behind the Sphinx's body, and intersects with a short horizontal passage. To the casual observer, the very presence of a shaft beneath such a monument can feel significant. A vertical descent implies depth. A horizontal continuation implies extension. In imagination, it becomes easy to add further turns, chambers, or hidden doors beyond what is actually there. Historically, the shaft is associated with 19th century exploration. In the 1830s, British military engineer Colonel Richard Howard Vyse and his assistant John Perring conducted excavations at Giza. Their work focused primarily on the pyramids, but exploratory activity extended across the plateau. Contemporary accounts describe digging near and around the Sphinx, including attempts to probe beneath it in search of hidden spaces. The rear shaft's dimensions and surface characteristics align with excavation methods of that era. The walls are rough and uneven. The interior lacks smoothing, lining, or architectural detailing. There are no carved inscriptions, no decorative reliefs, and no structural features suggesting deliberate ancient design. Instead, the shaft appears utilitarian, consistent with a test cut made to determine whether something lay below. The vertical portion descends several meters. At its base, a horizontal corridor extends briefly before terminating. There is no chamber at the end. The rock remains solid. If the shaft was intended to locate a cavity, it did not reveal one of substantial size. The passage does not connect to any known internal spaces within the Sphinx itself. When modern archaeologists examined the shaft, they compared its surfaces with documented ancient cutting techniques. Old Kingdom stonework, even when rough, tends to show characteristic tool marks consistent with copper chisels and stone pounders. 19th century excavation tools left different traces. The rear shaft's interior bears marks more consistent with modern methods than with ancient Egyptian craftsmanship. Despite this, the shaft became a focal point for speculation. Its location directly beneath the Sphinx suggested to some that it must have deeper significance. In popular accounts, it was sometimes described as an entrance to something concealed. Photographs, taken at angles that obscure its limited depth, have contributed to this perception. It is important to understand the difference between access and architecture. A shaft provides access to subsurface rock. Architecture involves deliberate planning, alignment, and finishing. The rear shaft shows evidence of access without evidence of architecture. It does not align with the monument's central axis. It does not connect to the Sphinx temple or to the pyramid complex. It is an isolated excavation. The geological context further clarifies its nature. Beneath the Sphinx lies layered limestone with natural fractures. When explorers dug the shaft, they encountered solid rock. The short horizontal extension may have followed a bedding plane or fracture line in the limestone. Its termination suggests that no significant cavity existed along that path. In later decades, conservation teams inspected the shaft to assess structural stability. They documented its dimensions and condition. Some stabilization measures were taken to ensure that it did not compromise the surrounding rock mass. The shaft was not extended further in modern times, as preservation concerns outweigh exploratory curiosity. For those inclined toward broader theories, the existence of any shaft beneath the Sphinx invites reinterpretation. Some have suggested that 19th century explorers may have encountered something and concealed it. There is no documented evidence supporting such claims. Excavation reports from the period do not describe the discovery of chambers beneath the monument. If a substantial void had been found, it would likely have been recorded, as other discoveries at Giza were documented with enthusiasm. The shaft's limited extent is a matter of measurement rather than opinion. Its depth and length have been surveyed. No branching corridors extend from it. No hidden doors have been identified within its walls. It ends in bedrock. Still, the psychological impact of descending into stone beneath an ancient monument should not be underestimated. Even a modest shaft can feel profound when it leads below the surface of something so old. Standing at its edge, one looks down into darkness framed by limestone carved long after the Sphinx itself was shaped. The imagination can easily fill that darkness with further depth. The rear shaft also illustrates how early exploration methods differ from modern archaeological practice. In the 19th century, excavation was often driven by the desire to locate tombs or treasure. Probing beneath monuments was considered a reasonable strategy. Today, intrusive digging beneath a structure like the Sphinx would be approached with extreme caution due to conservation priorities. When seismic surveys were conducted in the late 20th century, data from the area around the rear shaft were analysed alongside other subsurface measurements. The results did not indicate large cavities connected to the shaft. Instead, they showed density variations consistent with natural geological features. Some observers have questioned whether deeper cavities might exist beyond the depth reached by the 19th century excavation. While it is true that seismic and radar methods have resolution limits, significant hollow spaces would likely produce clearer signatures across multiple survey techniques. No such consistent evidence has been published. The shaft's presence, however, continues to appear in discussions about hidden chambers. It serves as a physical anchor for narratives that extend beyond its measured boundaries. Because it is visible and accessible in limited contexts, it becomes symbolic of access to the unknown. From an archaeological standpoint, the shaft is best understood as a historical artifact of exploration, rather than as part of the original monument. It tells a story about how 19th century researchers approached ancient sites. It reflects the curiosity and methods of its time. It does not provide evidence of a concealed hall beneath the Sphinx. The broader plateau contains other shafts and tunnels associated with tombs and later intrusions. Context matters. The Sphinx sits within a necropolis where underground spaces are common in certain areas. The absence of such architectural integration in the Sphinx itself reinforces the interpretation that the rear shaft is an exploratory feature rather than an intentional design element. As investigations continued into the late 20th century, attention shifted from visible shafts to invisible patterns detected through geophysical surveys. While the rear shaft remained a tangible feature, the focus broadened to encompass anomalies beneath the Paws and enclosure floor. Each dataset added detail to the subsurface map. The shaft at the rear represents a passage into the unknown, in a literal sense only for a short distance. Beyond that, the unknown remains geological rather than architectural. Its measured limits provide a boundary between documented fact and imagined extension. From here, the discussion moves toward the technologies that sought to map what could not be entered directly, particularly ground-penetrating radar, which attempted to create images of subsurface features without further excavation, refining the distinction between natural fractures and potential constructed voids beneath the monument. When archaeologists and engineers turned their attention from visible shafts and surface cracks to what might lie deeper beneath the Sphinx, they faced a familiar challenge. Digging blindly into bedrock risks damage. The monument is already fragile in places. Its lower limestone layers have endured millennia of erosion, salt crystallization, and restoration work. Large-scale excavation beneath it would introduce structural uncertainty. If something could be learned without cutting further into the stone, that method would be preferred. Ground-penetrating radar, often shortened to GPR, offered precisely that possibility. Instead of chisels or drills, it uses electromagnetic pulses. A radar antenna is moved across the surface of the ground, emitting short bursts of radio waves. When those waves encounter a boundary between materials with different electrical properties, part of the signal reflects back to the receiver. By measuring the time it takes for reflections to return and analysing their strength, researchers can create images of subsurface features. In practical terms, GPR allows scientists to see differences beneath the surface without opening the ground. It does not produce photographs of rooms, it produces patterns of reflections. Interpreting those patterns requires experience and correlation with known geological characteristics. When radar surveys were conducted around the Sphinx and within its enclosure, the goal was not to confirm prophecy, but to understand subsurface conditions. Engineers wanted to assess areas of weakness in the limestone, map fractures that might threaten stability, and clarify whether any significant cavities existed near the monument's base. The radar equipment was moved systematically across sections of the enclosure floor, and along accessible areas near the Sphinx's paws and flanks. Data were recorded as profiles showing reflections at various depths. In areas where the limestone was dense and uniform, reflections were relatively simple. In areas where cracks, voids, or moisture variations occurred, the reflected signals changed. Several radar anomalies were identified. These anomalies indicated zones where the electromagnetic waves encountered contrasts in material properties. In some cases, the anomalies corresponded to known features. A shallow cavity previously observed during restoration produced a clear reflection pattern. A backfilled trench from earlier excavation showed a distinct signature compared to undisturbed bedrock. Other anomalies were less immediately identifiable. Beneath parts of the enclosure floor, radar suggested irregular zones extending a few meters below the surface. These zones were interpreted as weathered limestone layers or fractured sections. Their shapes were uneven, following natural bedding planes rather than forming geometric outlines. It is important to clarify what radar can and cannot reveal. GPR is most effective at shallow depths, often within several meters, depending on soil and rock conditions. The limestone at Giza allows a reasonable penetration, but resolution decreases with depth. A large open chamber near the surface would likely produce a strong, distinct reflection. Smaller fractures or partially filled voids create subtler signals. In the case of the Sphinx, radar data did not show evidence of a vast constructed room beneath the monument's paws. No symmetrical rectangular reflection consistent with architectural walls appeared in published survey results. Instead, the anomalies detected were consistent with natural variability in limestone density. Some radar profiles indicated what appeared to be shallow cavities extending inward from the enclosure walls. These were examined in conjunction with visible erosion patterns. In most cases, they matched recesses already observable on the rock face. The radar confirmed their limited depth rather than extending them into hidden corridors. The interpretation process involves careful cross-checking. If radar suggests a void at a specific location, researchers compare that result with seismic data, visual inspection, and geological mapping. Consistency across methods increases confidence. In the Sphinx surveys, radar and seismic findings generally aligned in indicating fractured or weathered zones rather than open chambers. Public interest in radar findings was immediate. Reports describing anomalies beneath the Sphinx circulated widely. In some accounts, the technical language was simplified in ways that suggested discovery rather than variation. The word anomaly can imply mystery, but in geophysical terms it simply means a deviation from uniformity. Egyptian authorities overseeing the surveys emphasized conservation. The radar results were valuable for identifying areas requiring stabilization. If a section of bedrock beneath the enclosure was heavily fractured, engineers could adjust reinforcement plans accordingly. The primary objective was preservation, not treasure hunting. One of the more discussed radar findings involved an area near the right forepaw, corresponding loosely to the location described in Edgar Cayce's readings. The anomaly detected there was shallow and irregular. Follow-up analysis suggested that it reflected natural rock variability. No excavation was authorized to pursue it further, as the data did not justify invasive intervention. Another set of radar scans focused on the floor between the Sphinx and the Sphinx temple. Variations detected there were interpreted as quarry marks and backfilled extraction zones from the monument's original carving process. When the Sphinx was isolated from the surrounding bedrock, large blocks were removed. Those quarrying activities altered the subsurface structure, producing density contrasts detectable by radar. Radar surveys also clarified the limited extent of known shafts. The rear shaft's position and depth were mapped relative to surrounding rock. No additional branches were detected extending from its base within the resolution limits of the equipment. From a methodological standpoint, ground-penetrating radar marked a shift in how ancient sites were investigated. Rather than relying solely on excavation, archaeologists could now create subsurface models non-invasively. This approach aligns with modern preservation ethics, particularly at highly visited and structurally sensitive monuments. The data collected at the Sphinx contributed to a broader understanding of the plateau's geology. Limestone bedding planes were mapped with greater precision. Fracture networks were identified. Areas susceptible to water infiltration were noted. All of this information aids long-term conservation planning. For those hoping for confirmation of hidden chambers, the radar results were restrained. They showed complexity beneath the surface but not concealed architecture. They reinforced what geology predicts in sedimentary rock formations: variability, fractures, and occasional small cavities. It is worth noting that radar does not always provide definitive answers. Signal noise, surface irregularities and equipment limitations can complicate interpretation. Researchers therefore avoid drawing conclusions beyond what the data clearly support. In the Sphinx surveys, the consistent conclusion was that no large constructed spaces had been detected within the accessible depth range. The distinction between mapping and discovering is significant. Radar mapped differences in the stone. It did not discover sealed doors or corridors. It offered a clearer picture of subsurface conditions, narrowing the field of speculation rather than expanding it. As survey technologies continued to improve, attention turned toward integrating radar findings with official excavation records and conservation reports. Egyptian archaeologists and engineers worked to correlate instrument data with documented structural features, ensuring that every known cavity, fissure and shaft was accounted for within the broader geological model. The conversation about hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx, therefore, moved further into the realm of measurable detail. Instead of relying on echoes or rumour, researchers had reflection profiles and density maps. The monument's subsurface was no longer entirely unseen, even if it remained solid. With radar mapping what eyes could not see and seismic waves tracing density variations below, the next stage involved official excavations under Egyptian supervision, aimed at confirming, clarifying and documenting precisely what had been found in specific locations around the monument's base. By the late 20th century, discussions about hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx were no longer confined to independent researchers or spiritual interpretations. They had reached the desks of Egypt's highest antiquities officials. With increasing public attention and advancing survey technology, there was mounting pressure to clarify, in direct and documented terms, what actually existed beneath and around the monument. At the centre of these official efforts was Dr. Zahi Hawass, who served in various leadership roles within Egypt's Antiquities Administration, including as Secretary-General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities. Hawass became a prominent public face of Egyptian archaeology, particularly regarding Giza. His position gave him both authority and responsibility over excavation and conservation decisions at the Sphinx. Under his supervision, investigations around the monument were conducted with formal documentation, conservation oversight, and strict limitations. The priority was not to chase speculative claims, but to assess structural integrity, confirm survey data, and ensure that restoration efforts were grounded in accurate geological understanding. One of the key points addressed during these official investigations was the area beneath the Sphinx's Paws. This location had been singled out repeatedly in alternative narratives, particularly in connection with the Hall of Records prophecy. Seismic and radar surveys had detected minor anomalies in the vicinity. Public interest in this zone was intense. Controlled excavation in selected areas near the Paws was permitted under supervision. The digging was limited and careful. Layers of sand and debris were removed methodically. Archaeologists examined the bedrock directly rather than relying solely on instrument readings. What they encountered were natural fissures and variations in limestone density, consistent with prior geophysical interpretations. No constructed chamber was found beneath the Paws. No sealed doorway appeared in the bedrock. The anomalies previously detected corresponded to irregularities in the stone, rather than to human-designed architecture. The findings were recorded and reported through official channels. Attention also focused on the rear shaft discussed earlier. Under official review, the shaft's origin was assessed through analysis of tool marks and historical excavation records. Evidence supported the conclusion that it was a 19th century exploratory cut rather than an ancient feature. No extension beyond its known dimensions was identified. During conservation campaigns in the 1990s, engineers examined internal cavities within the Sphinx's body that had been exposed during earlier restoration. These cavities were mapped and stabilized. In some cases, modern masonry blocks placed during 20th century repairs were removed and replaced with improved reinforcement techniques. Documentation clarified the boundaries of each cavity. One particularly discussed feature was a small opening on the north side of the Sphinx's body. Under official inspection, this cavity was measured and photographed. It did not extend deeply. Its irregular shape and surface characteristics indicated either natural formation or enlargement during modern exploration. It did not connect to a network of passages. Official excavations also extended to the enclosure floor. Archaeologists examined areas where quarrying had occurred during the monument's creation. Blocks removed from the enclosure were traced to the construction of the adjacent Sphinx temple. This reinforced the integrated design of the complex and reduced the likelihood that significant pre-existing chambers had been left undisturbed beneath the monument. Hawass publicly addressed claims about hidden chambers in interviews and publications. He stated clearly that no evidence of a hall of records or similar large constructed space had been found beneath the Sphinx. His position was based on survey data, direct excavation results, and the broader archaeological context of Giza. Critics occasionally suggested that restrictions on excavation indicated concealment. From an archaeological and engineering perspective, the restrictions were practical. The Sphinx is structurally vulnerable. Its lower layers are softer limestone prone to erosion. Excavating beneath its foundation would introduce risk. Preservation policies therefore favoured minimal intrusion. Official investigations also benefited from collaboration with international teams specialising in geophysics and conservation. Data from seismic and radar surveys were cross-referenced with direct observations. When anomalies were detected, small test probes were sometimes conducted to verify their nature. In each documented case, results aligned with geological explanations. An important aspect of these official excavations was transparency and reporting. Findings were presented in academic conferences and publications. Photographs and diagrams illustrated the scale of cavities and shafts. While public interest often focused on dramatic possibilities, the official record emphasized measured reality. The role of Hawass in this context was both administrative and communicative. As a visible representative of Egyptian archaeology, he became a focal point for debates. Supporters viewed his firm statements as clarifying misinformation. Critics sometimes interpreted them as dismissive of alternative theories. Regardless of interpretation, the documented results of official excavations did not reveal hidden chambers of the scale imagined in legend. One must also consider the broader body of archaeological work at Giza. Excavations in the workers' village, analysis of quarry sites, and study of construction logistics have provided a coherent picture of 4th Dynasty activity on the plateau. The Sphinx fits within this pattern. Its creation, weathering, burial, and restoration phases are traceable through material evidence. If a large underground archive had existed beneath the monument, it would represent an architectural anomaly within this context. Its absence in official excavations strengthens the interpretation that the Sphinx's subsurface features are geological rather than constructed. Official work also addressed conservation concerns unrelated to speculation. Rising groundwater, salt crystallization, and pollution pose real threats to the monument. Stabilization efforts required detailed understanding of subsurface conditions. The surveys and limited excavations therefore served practical purposes beyond resolving legend. The controlled nature of these investigations contrasts sharply with earlier exploratory digging. Instead of wide shafts cut in hope of discovery, modern archaeology proceeds in narrow documented steps. Each excavation layer is recorded, each feature is mapped. The emphasis is on preservation and accuracy. As a result of these official excavations, the physical map of the Sphinx's subsurface became clearer. Known cavities were catalogued, natural fissures were identified, no extensive chamber system was uncovered. The archaeological line between measured fact and expansive legend was reinforced. The absence of dramatic discovery did not diminish the monument's significance. If anything, it underscored the importance of disciplined investigation. The Sphinx does not require hidden halls to remain extraordinary. Its scale, age, and integration with the Giza complex are remarkable in their own right. Yet even with official findings documented and published, discussion did not entirely cease. Speculation continued in some circles, often citing the very anomalies that official surveys had already explained. The persistence of debate reflects the enduring power of the Sphinx as a symbol. From the standpoint of documented excavation, however, the record is clear. Beneath the Sphinx, archaeologists found natural cavities, exploratory shafts, and fractured limestone consistent with geological formation and historical digging. They did not find a hidden archive. The conversation now turns toward a specific area frequently mentioned in both legend and survey reports: the region beneath the Paws themselves, where careful examination clarified precisely what was present and how those findings aligned with both geological expectation and earlier instrument readings. Few locations around the Sphinx have attracted as much focused attention as the area beneath its front paws. The image alone invites projection. The massive limestone paws extend forward, framing the dream stele placed between them during the reign of Thutmose IV. The space feels deliberate, ceremonial, almost like an entrance. Over time, this visual impression blended with prophecy, particularly the claim that a hidden chamber lay beneath the right forepaw. When geophysical surveys detected minor anomalies in that vicinity, interest intensified. What followed, however, was not the discovery of a vast hidden archive, but a measured sequence of verification. Egyptian authorities permitted limited investigation beneath and around the paws to determine the nature of those anomalies. The work was carried out carefully, layer by layer, under archaeological supervision. Sand was removed gradually. The exposed limestone surface was examined directly. The first observation was structural rather than mysterious. The Sphinx's paws are carved from the same limestone outcrop as the rest of the body. They rest on bedrock that slopes gently with the natural formation of the plateau. The enclosure floor in front of the monument was cut down during the original quarrying process. Blocks extracted from this area were used in the construction of the Sphinx temple nearby. As a result, the subsurface beneath the paws reflects both natural geology and quarrying activity. When investigators examined the zone beneath the right forepaw, they did encounter irregularities in the rock. These irregularities corresponded with the low-density anomalies identified in earlier seismic and radar surveys. Upon direct inspection, however, these were revealed to be natural fissures and weathered pockets within the limestone layers. The cavities were shallow. They did not extend downward into large open spaces. They followed bedding planes and fracture lines typical of sedimentary rock. In some places, softer limestone layers had eroded more deeply than adjacent harder strata, creating recesses beneath the surface. These recesses were measured and documented. No constructed chamber was uncovered. There were no carved walls forming right angles, no smooth ceilings, no evidence of masonry lining, no inscriptions, artifacts, or structural reinforcement indicative of deliberate interior architecture. The rock surfaces were irregular, matching natural geological patterns rather than human design. One small cavity beneath the paw was examined more closely because of its position relative to the dream stele. Measurements confirmed that it extended only a short distance inward, before tapering into solid stone. Its shape was uneven and followed a natural fracture. It did not connect to any broader passage. It is important to understand how such cavities form. Limestone is composed primarily of calcium carbonate. Over time, even in relatively arid climates, groundwater can infiltrate microfractures. Chemical reactions gradually dissolve portions of the stone, enlarging cracks. When the Sphinx was carved, workers removed surrounding material, altering stress distribution within the remaining rock. This process can accentuate existing fractures, especially along weaker layers. The result is a subsurface that is not perfectly uniform. Small voids occur naturally. The anomalies detected by instruments were consistent with these geological realities. When archaeologists examined them directly, they found no evidence of artificial construction within those spaces. The area beneath the left paw was also assessed. Similar patterns emerged. Minor fissures, shallow recesses, and natural weathering features were present. None extended into significant chambers. The bedrock beneath the paws remains largely solid. Some have asked whether deeper chambers might exist beyond the reach of limited excavation. The surveys conducted in the area provided depth estimates for anomalies. Most were within a few meters of the surface. Larger voids at greater depth would likely produce stronger and more distinct signatures in seismic and radar data. No such consistent signatures have been published in official reports. In addition to geological examination, archaeologists considered historical context. If an extensive chamber had been deliberately constructed beneath the Sphinx's paws during the Old Kingdom, it would represent a significant architectural undertaking. There is no record in contemporary inscriptions or reliefs describing such construction. The Sphinx Temple and Valley Temple nearby show evidence of careful planning and monumental stonework. No comparable architectural traces appear beneath the paws. The dream stele itself was carefully studied during these investigations. Placed in the New Kingdom, it records a narrative about Thutmose IV clearing sand from the Sphinx. It does not describe entering a chamber beneath it. The stele's position between the paws may contribute visually to the sense of a threshold, but its inscription focuses on royal legitimacy rather than concealed spaces. During the official inspections, engineers also assessed structural integrity. The presence of small cavities requires monitoring because voids can weaken support if they enlarge. Stabilization measures were implemented where necessary. In some cases, modern reinforcement materials were inserted to ensure that erosion did not compromise the monument's base. Public reaction to the findings was mixed. Those inclined toward evidence-based interpretation saw the results as clarification. Those invested in the Hall of Records narrative often argued that the excavation had not gone deep enough. However, from a conservation perspective, the extent of excavation was determined by safety considerations and by the scale of anomalies detected. The chamber beneath the paw, as popularly imagined, does not exist in the form described in legend. What exists are natural limestone irregularities consistent with the geological character of the plateau. The distinction is not subtle when measured directly. A natural cavity has irregular contours and follows bedding planes. A constructed chamber exhibits intentional geometry and finishing. Beneath the paws, investigators found the former, not the latter. It is also worth noting that modern technology continues to evolve. If future non-invasive methods were to detect new anomalies warranting investigation, they would be evaluated through the same careful process. As of the documented official excavations, however, no hidden archive or constructed room has been found beneath the Sphinx's paws. The findings beneath the paws reinforce a broader pattern observed throughout subsurface studies at Giza. The plateau contains variability, fissures, and occasional small voids. These features are part of its natural structure. Where human intervention has occurred, it is documented and limited. Understanding what was actually found beneath the paw helps ground the broader conversation. The Sphinx does not conceal a vast underground hall at its base. Its foundation rests on limestone shaped by both geological processes and ancient quarrying. The mystery beneath the paws is one of natural stone, not hidden archives. From this clarified location, attention shifts toward a related question, often raised in connection with subsurface features, whether water, weathering, and geological change over time could have produced cavities larger than those currently observed, and how such processes inform interpretations of what may lie deeper within the plateau. Long before there were pyramids on the horizon, or a lion's body carved from stone, the Giza Plateau was part of a very different landscape. The limestone from which the Sphinx was shaped formed in a shallow sea during the Eocene epoch, tens of millions of years ago. Layer upon layer of marine sediment compressed into rock. Over geological time, uplift and erosion exposed these layers, creating the ridge that ancient Egyptian builders would later transform into a monument. Understanding what water can do to limestone is central to understanding the plateau itself. Limestone is not a uniform material. It contains bedding planes, fossil inclusions, and varying densities depending on how sediment settled and hardened. When water interacts with limestone, particularly water containing dissolved carbon dioxide, it creates a weak carbonic acid. This acid reacts with calcium carbonate, slowly dissolving it. The process can enlarge microfractures into fissures and, in some environments, form extensive cave systems. In regions with sustained rainfall and groundwater movement, limestone landscapes often develop what geologists call karst formations. These include sinkholes, underground rivers, and interconnected cave networks. The question often asked about the Sphinx is whether similar processes could have produced larger cavities beneath it in the distant past. The modern climate of Giza is arid. Rainfall is minimal. However, the region's climate has not always been the same. During parts of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, North Africa experienced wetter conditions. There were periods when rainfall was more frequent and groundwater movement more pronounced. These climatic shifts are documented in sediment cores and regional geological studies. Even so, the development of large karst systems requires specific conditions sustained over long periods. The limestone at Giza does show evidence of weathering and small-scale dissolution features. Fractures and shallow cavities occur, as documented by geophysical surveys and direct inspection. What it does not show, based on current geological mapping, is evidence of extensive cavern systems comparable to those in wetter limestone regions. The enclosure walls around the Sphinx provide visible evidence of weathering. Vertical channels and rounded contours appear in some sections. These features have fueled debate about whether rainfall erosion contributed significantly to the monument's current form. Regardless of interpretation, weathering has clearly acted on the stone over millennia. Below the surface, water infiltration can follow natural joints and bedding planes. If water once percolated through the plateau more actively than it does today, it could have widened existing fractures. The anomalies detected in seismic and radar surveys likely correspond to such zones of increased fracturing or partial dissolution. However, the scale of these features remains modest. Survey data and limited excavation indicate cavities measured in meters rather than tens of meters. There is no published geological evidence supporting the presence of a vast ancient cavern beneath the Sphinx. One must also consider the mechanical history of the site. When ancient builders carved the Sphinx, they removed large volumes of rock from the surrounding area. This quarrying altered the stress distribution within the remaining bedrock. Changes in stress can open existing fractures slightly, or create new microfractures. Over centuries, environmental factors such as temperature fluctuations and salt crystallization can further widen these cracks. Salt crystallization is particularly relevant in desert environments. Groundwater containing dissolved salts can rise through capillary action. When the water evaporates, salt crystals form within pores and fractures, exerting pressure that gradually expands them. This process contributes to surface flaking and internal weakening. It can enlarge fissures but typically does not create large open chambers. The possibility of ancient cavities also intersects with human activity. If natural pockets existed in the bedrock during the Old Kingdom, workers carving the Sphinx may have encountered them. They could have removed weaker sections during shaping. The monument that remains today reflects selective carving from more stable layers. Geologists studying the plateau have mapped the Macadam Formation extensively. The layers beneath the Sphinx consist of alternating hard and soft strata. Softer layers erode more readily, creating undercuts and shallow recesses. Harder layers form ledges. This stratification explains many of the irregularities observed beneath the surface. If a large cavity had existed directly beneath the Sphinx before carving, it would likely have compromised the stability of the monument. Ancient builders appear to have selected a relatively solid portion of the ridge for carving. The monument's survival for over 4 millennia suggests that its foundation rests on stable rock. Rather than on an extensive hollow, geophysical surveys conducted to date support this interpretation. Seismic velocities beneath the Sphinx indicate predominantly solid limestone with localized fractured zones. Ground-penetrating radar profiles show shallow anomalies, but no broad voids consistent with major cavern systems. It is theoretically possible for deeper cavities to exist beyond the effective range of certain survey methods. However, significant hollow spaces would alter wave propagation patterns in measurable ways. Repeated surveys using different techniques have not revealed such signatures beneath the monument's base. Another factor to consider is regional geology. While parts of Egypt do contain cave systems, the Giza Plateau is not known for extensive karst development. Its limestone is relatively compact compared to regions where large caves form. The plateau's elevation and drainage patterns further limit sustained groundwater flow. The notion of ancient cavities often arises from the intersection of geological possibility and symbolic expectation. The Sphinx, as a guardian figure, invites the idea of something hidden below. When small natural cavities are confirmed, it becomes tempting to extrapolate them into something larger. Scientific investigation tempers that extrapolation by measuring scale and distribution. Water and weathering have undeniably shaped the Sphinx and its enclosure. They have carved channels into the walls and widened microfractures in the stone. They have contributed to the monument's weathered appearance. What they have not demonstrably produced beneath it is an extensive underground chamber. This conclusion does not diminish the complexity of the site. The interplay between geology, climate history, and human engineering is intricate. The plateau carries a record of environmental change and ancient activity layered together. As discussion continues, some propose that if cavities exist, they might predate the Sphinx itself, formed long before human carving began. Evaluating that possibility requires examining whether geological formations beneath the monument could have existed independently, and whether ancient builders might have incorporated or modified them during construction. When discussions about cavities beneath the Sphinx move beyond prophecy and into geology, a more subtle question sometimes appears. If small voids exist within the limestone, could they predate the monument itself? Could natural cavities have formed long before the Sphinx was carved, and might the ancient builders have encountered them as they shaped the stone? To address that, it helps to step back from the monument and look at the bedrock as it would have existed before any human intervention. The ridge from which the Sphinx was carved was part of a larger limestone formation that had already endured millions of years of geological processes. Sedimentary layers accumulated in ancient seas, hardened into rock, and were later uplifted and exposed. Long before the Fourth Dynasty, fractures, joints, and small dissolution pockets may have formed within those layers. Natural cavities in limestone can develop slowly. Even in relatively dry climates, periodic groundwater movement and chemical weathering can enlarge fractures over extended time spans. It is entirely plausible that minor voids existed in the ridge before ancient workers began cutting trenches around it to isolate the Sphinx. The critical distinction lies in scale. Small pockets and fissures can form naturally. Large, architecturally usable chambers are far less common in compact limestone formations without sustained karst development. The Giza Plateau does not exhibit evidence of extensive pre-existing cave systems of the kind seen in wetter limestone regions. If ancient workers encountered natural voids during carving, they would have had to decide how to respond. The Sphinx was sculpted by cutting away surrounding stone and then shaping the remaining mass. Any substantial cavity within that mass would have affected structural stability. Builders aiming to create a durable monument would likely avoid leaving large unsupported spaces within the core. Archaeological examination of the Sphinx's body suggests that ancient builders worked selectively within the limestone layers. Softer sections were reinforced or faced with additional masonry in later periods. Areas too fragile to support the intended shape were likely removed during carving. The monument that survives appears to rest on relatively solid strata. Some proponents of alternative chronologies have suggested that if natural cavities existed prior to carving, they might have been enlarged or repurposed by an earlier unknown civilization. However, no archaeological evidence supports this scenario. There are no tool marks within the documented cavities that predate Old Kingdom techniques. No artifacts have been recovered from beneath the monument, indicating earlier occupation directly under its footprint. Geophysical surveys have also contributed to this assessment. Seismic data indicate fractured zones but not extensive pre-carved chambers. If a large cavity had existed beneath the ridge before carving, it would likely have produced a distinct subsurface signature detectable across multiple survey methods. The anomalies observed to date align with fractured rock rather than open cavern systems. It is worth remembering that the Sphinx was not built atop prepared foundations in the way later structures sometimes were. It was carved in place from bedrock. That means any pre-existing cavity would have been directly intersected by the carving process. The absence of visible collapse or large-scale subsidence beneath the monument suggests that no significant hollow space was left within its supporting rock. Geological mapping of the Mokattam Formation at Giza shows consistent stratification. While natural fractures are present, the formation lacks the deep vertical shafts and interconnected chambers characteristic of mature karst landscapes. The plateau's relative stability over millennia further indicates that large voids are unlikely beneath major monuments. The question of older cavities also intersects with debates about the Sphinx's age. Some researchers argue that patterns of erosion suggest a date earlier than the 4th dynasty. Even within that debate, however, there is no firm geological evidence of extensive subsurface chambers predating the carving. If the monument were significantly older than currently accepted, and if it had been carved atop an already cavernous ridge, structural instability would likely have manifested long ago. The Sphinx has endured weathering, sand burial and restoration, but it has not collapsed due to foundational voids. When limited cavities have been documented beneath or within the Sphinx, their irregular shapes follow natural bedding planes rather than forming distinct architectural outlines. This pattern is consistent with minor geological features rather than with intentionally preserved ancient chambers. Another practical consideration is quarrying. During the Sphinx's creation, large volumes of stone were removed from the surrounding enclosure. If substantial cavities had existed within the ridge, quarry workers would have encountered them. There is no record of ancient inscriptions describing the discovery of pre-existing underground spaces beneath the monument. The temples adjacent to the Sphinx were constructed using blocks quarried from the enclosure. These blocks show consistent material properties with the bedrock beneath the monument. There is no evidence that blocks were cut from around a pre-existing large cavity and then assembled in a way that concealed it. While it is geologically reasonable to accept that small natural voids predated the Sphinx, the evidence does not support the existence of large chambers older than the monument. The natural features identified so far are limited in scale and consistent with long-term weathering patterns. In assessing this possibility, archaeologists combine geological analysis with structural observation. They examine whether the monument shows signs of subsidence or cracking that would indicate underlying instability. Although the Sphinx exhibits erosion and surface weathering, there is no structural pattern suggesting that it was carved over a significant hollow. The idea that ancient builders might have discovered a natural cavity and intentionally incorporated it into hidden architecture remains speculative without material evidence. No carved entrances, reinforcing masonry, or tool marks within known cavities indicate such modification. The distinction between geological possibility and archaeological probability is central here. It is possible for limestone to contain natural voids formed long before human occupation. It is not probable, based on current evidence, that large chambers existed beneath the Sphinx prior to carving and remained undetected during both ancient construction and modern survey. By examining the bedrock beneath the monument through both geological mapping and geophysical measurement, researchers have developed a coherent model. The plateau contains fractured zones and minor cavities typical of sedimentary limestone. It does not contain expansive pre-existing caverns beneath the Sphinx's footprint. The persistence of this question reflects the enduring appeal of hidden depth. When a monument has stood for millennia, it invites the idea that it might rest upon secrets older still. The geological record, however, points toward incremental natural processes rather than concealed ancient halls. With the possibility of older natural chambers largely constrained by available data, the narrative shifts toward another recurring theme: the idea of a hidden library or archive that, though never found, continues to resurface in popular imagination, reshaping how each new survey result is interpreted in light of expectations rather than evidence. Even after official excavations had clarified the limited nature of cavities beneath the Sphinx, and after seismic and radar surveys had failed to reveal any vast constructed chambers, the idea of a hidden library did not disappear. In fact, in some ways, it became more persistent. The absence of a discovery did not quiet the narrative. Instead, it shifted the tone from anticipation to insistence. The so-called Hall of Records, often described as a repository of ancient knowledge preserved beneath the Sphinx, continued to circulate in books, documentaries, and lectures. The story evolved with each retelling. In some versions, the chamber held scrolls describing a lost civilization. In others, it contained advanced technology or astronomical data far beyond what ancient Egypt is credited with possessing. The specific details varied, but the central premise remained the same: something extraordinary lay hidden, waiting to be revealed. One reason this myth endured is that it filled a psychological space. The Sphinx, by its very nature, invites interpretation. It predates most surviving monuments. It was already ancient in the time of the New Kingdom pharaohs. When Thutmose IV placed the dream stele between its paws, he was interacting with a structure that had stood for over 1,000 years. That layered antiquity fosters the sense that deeper layers might exist both physically and historically, and, in popular imagination, the idea of a hidden archive beneath such a monument feels proportionate to its scale. A statue that large seems worthy of a secret equally grand. The modest geological cavities documented by archaeologists do not match that expectation. When measured evidence falls short of narrative desire, myth often compensates. Media portrayals played a significant role in sustaining the legend. Television specials sometimes framed subsurface anomalies as tantalizing hints. Dramatic music accompanied images of radar screens. Phrases like mysterious void or unexplored cavity appeared in promotional materials. Even when the underlying data were cautious and technical, the presentation could amplify mystery. The myth also adapted to new discoveries elsewhere. When a large void was detected inside the Great Pyramid of Khufu using muon tomography in 2017, some commentators immediately linked it to long-standing claims about hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx. Although the two sites are distinct and the pyramid void remains under study, the association reinforced the idea that Egypt still conceals major undiscovered spaces. In reality, the Great Pyramid's newly detected void is located within its internal structure, not beneath the Sphinx. The methods used to detect it differ from those applied at the Sphinx. The geological and architectural contexts are separate, yet the broader narrative of hidden spaces in Egypt tends to merge these distinct cases into a single theme. Another factor contributing to the myth's persistence is the concept of suppressed knowledge. When official statements deny the existence of a hidden library, some interpret this as concealment rather than conclusion. The logic becomes circular. The absence of evidence is seen as evidence of secrecy. In such a framework, measured refutation strengthens belief rather than diminishing it. The Sphinx's restricted access policies also feed this perception. Because excavation beneath the monument is tightly controlled for conservation reasons, it is easy to imagine that more extensive digging could reveal something dramatic. What is often overlooked is that large-scale excavation beneath a 4,500-year-old limestone monument would introduce structural risks far outweighing speculative benefits. From an archaeological perspective, myths endure because they address questions that evidence alone does not fully satisfy. The Sphinx's origin, function, and symbolism are well studied, yet they remain open to interpretation within defined historical boundaries. A hidden library offers a different kind of answer. It suggests that history itself is incomplete, and that a single discovery could transform our understanding of the past. No physical trace of such a library has been documented beneath the Sphinx. Official excavations beneath the Paws revealed natural fissures. The rear shaft was identified as a 19th century exploratory cut. Radar and seismic surveys mapped fractured limestone rather than constructed halls. No inscriptions or artifacts have been recovered from beneath the monument that point to a concealed archive. The endurance of the myth demonstrates how narrative can outlive contradiction. Once established, a story takes on its own momentum. It becomes part of cultural memory. Each new survey or conservation effort is interpreted through its lens. An anomaly becomes a clue. A restricted area becomes a sealed entrance. It is also worth noting that ancient Egypt did maintain archives and libraries, but these were associated with temples and administrative centres, not concealed beneath monuments. Papyrus scrolls were stored in designated spaces within temple complexes. There is no textual tradition from ancient Egypt describing a subterranean archive beneath the Sphinx. The idea of hidden wisdom preserved in stone resonates beyond Egypt. Many cultures have myths of lost knowledge sealed away from humanity. The Sphinx, with its silent gaze and immense age, provides a fitting stage for such a theme. The legend persists not because of archaeological support, but because it aligns with broader cultural motifs. Archaeologists draw a distinction between possibility and probability. It is possible that unknown features remain beneath the plateau, as it is possible at any ancient site. It is not probable, based on current evidence, that a vast constructed library lies beneath the Sphinx. The documented cavities are limited and geological in nature. The phrase, "the library that wasn't there," reflects this contrast between expectation and excavation. What was found beneath the Sphinx does not match the scale of the myth. Yet the myth continues to circulate, often detached from the measured findings that prompted investigation in the first place. As long as the Sphinx stands, facing the rising sun, the space beneath it will remain a focus of curiosity. The challenge for archaeology is not to extinguish curiosity, but to guide it through evidence. Each documented cavity, each mapped fissure, each clarified shaft adds to a picture grounded in stone rather than in speculation. With the legend of a hidden library persisting in public imagination, attention often turns toward claims of secret projects and hidden doors, suggesting that what has not been found might still be concealed deliberately, and it is within that framework that discussions of covert excavations and restricted areas frequently emerge. When a monument has stood for more than 4,000 years, when it has been buried, uncovered, restored, scanned, photographed, televised, and debated, it becomes more than stone. It becomes a stage for expectation, and where expectation meets restricted access, another narrative often begins to take shape. Around the Sphinx, that narrative has taken the form of alleged secret projects and hidden doors. The structure of the claim is familiar. Official excavations are said to have uncovered something significant. The discovery is then said to have been sealed or concealed. Restricted zones are interpreted not as preservation measures, but as barriers to hidden truth. The absence of public access becomes, in some accounts, evidence that something is being kept from view. To understand why these claims persist, it helps to consider how the Sphinx site is managed. The Giza Plateau is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. Millions of people move through the area each year. The Sphinx itself is fragile. Its lower limestone layers are soft and heavily weathered. Conservation efforts have required reinforcement, stone replacement, and careful monitoring of groundwater levels. As a result, access to certain areas is restricted for safety and preservation. Restricted access, however, is often interpreted symbolically. A closed gate can appear mysterious. A cordoned-off section of rock can seem significant. Photographs of archaeologists working in controlled areas may circulate without context, leading to assumptions about secret excavation. In reality, large-scale projects at Giza are rarely covert. International collaboration, academic publication, and media coverage accompany most significant work. When geophysical surveys are conducted, they are typically documented in technical reports. When restoration campaigns occur, they are photographed and described in conservation literature. One recurring claim concerns sealed doors or blocked passages within the Sphinx's body. In the documented record, small cavities have been encountered and stabilized. In some cases, modern masonry was used in earlier restoration phases to support weakened stone. These reinforcement blocks can appear to an uninformed observer as intentional closures. In fact, they are conservation measures. Another claim suggests that tunnels beneath the Sphinx connect to the pyramids. No archaeological survey has identified such a connection. The geological distance and structural differences between the monuments make this unlikely. The Great Pyramid's internal architecture is well documented. Its known corridors do not extend toward the Sphinx. Seismic surveys between the two monuments have not revealed a continuous hollow passage. There are also assertions that radar scans revealed large voids that were never investigated publicly. In official publications, radar anomalies are described with measured language and are often followed by test probes or visual inspection. When anomalies correspond to natural fractures, that interpretation is reported. The suggestion that such findings were suppressed does not align with the documented record. Part of the confusion arises from technical terminology. Words like void, anomaly, and subsurface feature sound dramatic outside scientific context. In geophysical reporting, they simply denote differences in material properties. When translated into popular discourse, they can take on exaggerated meaning. Media portrayal contributes as well. Television programs sometimes frame routine conservation as secret excavation. A temporary scaffold around a section of the Sphinx may be presented as access to a hidden interior. Viewers unfamiliar with restoration practices may interpret routine structural reinforcement as evidence of concealed chambers. The broader pattern mirrors similar narratives at other ancient sites. Restricted military areas, protective fencing, and limited excavation permits often generate speculation. The idea that knowledge is intentionally withheld can be compelling, particularly when combined with legends of lost wisdom. However, archaeology operates within a framework of documentation. Excavation permits, field notes, stratigraphic diagrams, and artifact inventories form part of the permanent record. Major discoveries are typically published sometimes years later after analysis, but rarely hidden entirely. The professional credibility of archaeologists depends on transparent reporting. At Giza, international teams have participated in surveys and conservation projects. Collaboration between Egyptian authorities and foreign researchers has produced peer-reviewed studies. While disagreements and debates occur within academic circles, there is no documented evidence of a large chamber beneath the Sphinx being found and concealed. It is also important to recognize that conspiracy narratives often adapt to new information. When one claim is clarified, another emerges. If no chamber is found beneath the paw, perhaps it lies deeper. If radar does not show a hall, perhaps the instruments were limited. If excavation is restricted, perhaps it is restricted to prevent revelation. The narrative shifts rather than resolves. Confusion can also arise from historical layering. 19th century explorers left shafts and tunnels. 20th century restorers added reinforcement blocks. Modern engineers installed monitoring equipment. Without clear context, these elements can appear as deliberate concealment rather than as successive phases of intervention. The Sphinx's enduring presence encourages projection. It feels older than the records that describe it. It feels self-contained, as if it might guard something significant. When combined with the Hall of Records legend, even routine maintenance can be interpreted as a cover for secret activity. From a structural perspective, the risks of extensive hidden excavation beneath the Sphinx would be significant. Large voids beneath its base would weaken support. Engineers monitoring the monument would detect signs of subsidence or unusual stress. The absence of such structural anomalies further supports the conclusion that no vast concealed chamber exists directly beneath it. It is possible, as at any ancient site, that undiscovered features remain elsewhere on the plateau. Archaeology is an ongoing process. But the claim of a secret chamber already found and hidden beneath the Sphinx lacks documentary support. Distinguishing conspiracy from confusion requires attention to detail. When photographs of interior cavities appear online, one must ask whether they correspond to known restoration zones. When reports mention anomalies, one must read the accompanying technical explanation. In most cases, the dramatic interpretation dissolves under closer inspection. The persistence of these narratives reveals more about modern expectations than about ancient stone. We live in a time when information travels rapidly, often detached from context. A single image or phrase can generate widespread speculation. The Sphinx, silent and immovable, becomes a canvas onto which those speculations are projected. Yet the documented record remains consistent. Official excavations have not uncovered hidden archives. Geophysical surveys have mapped fractured limestone. Known shafts are attributed to historical exploration. Restoration projects aim to preserve, not conceal. The line between secrecy and stewardship is often misunderstood. Protecting a monument from damage requires limiting access and controlling excavation. That protection can appear secretive from a distance. Within the framework of conservation, it is routine. With the claims of hidden doors and covert discoveries examined and weighed against documented evidence, the remaining question becomes more practical than dramatic. Why, despite decades of survey and inspection, certain small cavities and fractured zones remain unopened, not out of secrecy, but because of structural and preservation considerations that shape every decision made around the monument? When people hear that small cavities or anomalies have been detected beneath or within the Sphinx, a natural reaction follows. If something is there, why not open it? Why not drill, excavate, or descend into every detected void until every question is answered? The impulse is understandable. The Sphinx is ancient. Curiosity feels justified, yet the decision not to open certain cavities is not rooted in secrecy. It is grounded in structural reality, conservation ethics, and practical risk assessment. The Sphinx is not a freestanding statue assembled from blocks. It is a remnant of bedrock shaped into form. Its body and paws are continuous with the limestone ridge beneath them. That ridge contains layers of varying hardness. The lower strata are softer and more porous. Over thousands of years, these layers have weathered unevenly. Cracks, microfractures, and shallow dissolution pockets exist within the stone. When geophysical surveys detect a subsurface anomaly, it means that the physical properties of the rock differ slightly in that zone. It does not mean there is a clean, accessible chamber with walls and a floor. Many anomalies correspond to fractured rock partially filled with debris or compacted sediment. Accessing such zones would require cutting through supporting bedrock. From an engineering standpoint, removing material beneath a structure changes stress distribution. The Sphinx's weight rests on the integrity of its foundation. Even small alterations can introduce instability. The monument has already endured centuries of erosion, sand pressure, salt crystallization, and restoration interventions. Engineers monitor its condition carefully. Introducing new voids or enlarging existing ones is not a trivial decision. Conservation philosophy has evolved significantly over the past century. Earlier exploration often prioritized discovery over preservation. Today, the guiding principle at major heritage sites is minimal intervention. Archaeologists and conservators aim to stabilise what exists rather than to disturb it unnecessarily. If a cavity appears natural and poses no structural threat, there is little justification for invasive excavation. There is also the matter of scale. The cavities detected beneath the Sphinx are typically small and irregular. They do not resemble sealed rooms waiting to be entered. Opening them would likely reveal fractured limestone surfaces, not decorated walls. The cost-benefit analysis does not favour invasive access when the expected informational return is minimal and the structural risk is tangible. In some cases, small test probes have been conducted to confirm the nature of anomalies. When such probes verify that a feature is a natural fissure or weathered pocket, further excavation is halted. Each probe leaves a trace. Every incision into ancient stone carries consequences. Conservators weigh these consequences carefully. Environmental factors also play a role. The Giza Plateau is subject to temperature fluctuations between day and night. Expansion and contraction of limestone exacerbate microfractures. Groundwater levels in the region have changed due to urban development and irrigation. Increased moisture can infiltrate cracks, leading to salt crystallization and further weakening. Introducing new openings into the stone can alter airflow and moisture distribution in unpredictable ways. Safety considerations extend beyond the monument itself. Excavating beneath the Sphinx would require scaffolding, drilling equipment, and personnel operating in confined spaces. The risk to workers must be evaluated alongside the risk to the monument. If the potential discovery is speculative and the structural hazards are real, caution prevails. Some cavities remain unopened because they are inaccessible without removing overlying stone. The Sphinx's body is not hollow. Reaching deeper fractured zones would involve cutting through intact limestone that forms part of the visible monument. Such action would permanently alter the structure. Preservation policies do not permit this without compelling evidence of significant cultural content. Another factor is documentation. The plateau has been surveyed extensively. Seismic, radar, and resistivity data provide a three-dimensional understanding of subsurface conditions within certain depth ranges. When anomalies are consistent across methods and align with known geological patterns, the need for direct access diminishes. Scientists can infer with reasonable confidence that the feature is natural. It is also important to recognize that archaeology is cumulative. Not every potential void must be opened immediately. Technologies improve over time. Non-invasive imaging methods continue to evolve. What cannot be resolved clearly today might be clarified in the future without cutting into the stone. Leaving certain cavities unopened preserves that possibility. The idea that unopened spaces imply hidden secrets is a narrative leap. In most cases, unopened cavities remain so because opening them would cause more harm than insight. The Sphinx's longevity depends on restraint as much as on investigation. Historical experience reinforces this caution. Earlier restoration efforts in the 20th century sometimes used cement blocks that later proved incompatible with the original limestone. Removing those materials required delicate work. Each intervention left traces. Modern conservation strives to avoid repeating such unintended consequences. There is also the matter of precedent. If authorities were to authorize invasive excavation based on speculative claims, it would set a standard difficult to control. Heritage sites worldwide face pressure from theories promising dramatic discoveries. Maintaining a consistent evidence-based approach protects not only the Sphinx, but also broader archaeological practice. Public interest often focuses on what might be found rather than on what might be lost. Cutting into bedrock can introduce pathways for moisture infiltration. It can destabilize surrounding layers. It can accelerate erosion in areas already weakened. The monument's survival depends on limiting such risks. It is possible that minor natural cavities exist deeper within the plateau that have never been directly observed. That is true of any sedimentary formation. The presence of such cavities does not automatically imply human modification or cultural content. Without strong evidence suggesting otherwise, conservation principles favour leaving them undisturbed. The Sphinx's endurance across millennia reflects both ancient craftsmanship and modern stewardship. Preservation decisions are shaped by long-term perspective. A cavity that has existed harmlessly for thousands of years does not require immediate opening simply to satisfy curiosity. In archaeological terms, unanswered questions are not failures. They are part of the process. Documentation accumulates gradually. Evidence is weighed carefully. Where investigation would compromise integrity, restraint is chosen. Understanding why some cavities remain unopened clarifies the balance between exploration and preservation. The Sphinx is not a sealed container waiting to be unpacked. It is a fragile monument integrated with its bedrock foundation. Its mystery lies as much in what is visible as in what is not. From this measured perspective, the discussion shifts toward a different line of thought. If, hypothetically, a significant chamber had existed beneath the Sphinx, what might it have contained, and how would such a discovery fit within the known framework of ancient Egyptian culture and architecture, rather than within speculative legend? If for a moment we set aside geology, surveys, excavation reports, and conservation policies, and simply consider the idea on its own terms, the question becomes more precise. If a hall of records existed beneath the Sphinx, what would it logically contain? Not in the language of prophecy or science fiction, but in the framework of what we know about ancient Egyptian culture, record-keeping, and architecture. Ancient Egypt was not a civilization that avoided documentation. On the contrary, it recorded extensively. Administrative texts were written on papyrus. Temple walls were inscribed with reliefs detailing rituals, offerings, and royal achievements. Tomb walls were covered in scenes of daily life and funerary texts designed to guide the deceased into the afterlife. Inscriptions appear on stelae, statues, obelisks, and sarcophagi. If an official archive were constructed in pharaonic Egypt, it would likely contain papyrus scrolls. These scrolls might record temple inventories, priestly lineages, astronomical observations, or royal decrees. Papyrus, however, is fragile. Even in Egypt's dry climate, preservation over thousands of years requires stable, sealed conditions. Known caches of papyri, such as those found at Deir el-Medina or in tombs, survived because they were buried and undisturbed. If a chamber had been deliberately built beneath the Sphinx during the Old Kingdom, its purpose would need to align with Egyptian religious and architectural practice. The Sphinx is generally understood as part of a mortuary complex, integrated with the Pyramid of Khafra. Its role appears symbolic and ceremonial, not archival. There are no Old Kingdom inscriptions referencing a subterranean library beneath it. In contrast, temple complexes sometimes included storage rooms. These rooms held ritual objects, statues, and papyri. They were built as part of the temple's above-ground structure. They were accessible to priests. They were not hidden beneath colossal statues. If one imagines a hall of records predating the Old Kingdom, belonging to an earlier civilization, the contents become more speculative. Would it contain stone tablets, metal artifacts, astronomical charts, advanced technology? Such items would represent a cultural and technological level not supported by the archaeological record of the region prior to dynastic Egypt. Material evidence from pre-dynastic Egypt includes pottery, stone tools, and early inscriptions. There is no sign of an advanced lost civilization with metal libraries or precision instruments concealed beneath Giza. Archaeology is cumulative. Technologies leave traces. Metallurgy, architecture, and tool production produce waste materials and workshops. No such evidence has been found in association with the Sphinx's footprint. If the hypothetical chamber belonged to the Old Kingdom itself, its most plausible contents would be consistent with that era's knowledge. Astronomical observations were already part of Egyptian culture. The orientation of pyramids reflects awareness of cardinal directions and celestial bodies. Records of such knowledge were inscribed in temples and tombs, not hidden underground. There is also the question of architectural practicality. A large chamber designed to store records would require ventilation, structural reinforcement and access routes. It would need to be constructed intentionally, not left as a natural void. The absence of architectural traces in subsurface surveys argues against the presence of such a deliberately built space. In alternative narratives, the Hall of Records is often described as containing the history of humanity, perhaps even instructions for future generations. This idea aligns more closely with mythic motifs than with documented Egyptian practice. Egyptian texts were concerned with kingship, ritual, cosmology, and moral order. They were not secret compendiums of universal history hidden beneath monuments. Even if one imagines a symbolic archive, perhaps a chamber storing ceremonial objects linked to the Sphinx's cult, the scale would likely be modest. Small storage niches or foundation deposits were common in Egyptian architecture. These deposits sometimes contained miniature tools, amulets, or inscribed tablets placed during construction. They were symbolic offerings rather than vast repositories. It is worth examining known foundation deposits at other Old Kingdom sites. These deposits are typically found beneath corners of temples or at key structural points. They are small and intentional. No evidence of a large foundation chamber beneath the Sphinx has been documented in excavation records. If a chamber did exist and contained papyrus scrolls, preservation would depend on environmental stability. Subsurface humidity fluctuations over millennia would likely degrade organic material unless the chamber were perfectly sealed. No such sealed environment has been identified beneath the monument. The concept of a Hall of Records often merges Egyptian history with the legend of Atlantis. In those versions, the chamber contains artifacts from a civilization predating Egypt. From an archaeological standpoint, this scenario requires extraordinary evidence. So far, no physical trace of Atlantean material culture has been found at Giza or anywhere else. One can also consider the broader pattern of Egyptian monumental design. When Egyptians wished to preserve texts permanently, they carved them into stone. The pyramid texts, coffin texts, and later the Book of the Dead were inscribed on walls and sarcophagi. If a crucial archive existed, carving it into durable material above ground would be consistent with practice. Imagining the contents of a Hall of Records, therefore, reveals a mismatch between legend and documented cultural behaviour. The image of a hidden underground library resonates with modern expectations of secrecy and revelation. Ancient Egypt, by contrast, expressed sacred knowledge openly on temple walls and stelae. If a chamber existed, and if it contained objects, archaeologists would expect to find architectural markers, cut walls, levelling marks, possibly plastering, or at least clear human modification. No such markers have been identified beneath the Sphinx's base. The exercise of imagining what such a chamber might contain highlights the difference between narrative desire and material probability. The most plausible contents would be ordinary by ancient standards: ritual objects, small inscriptions, perhaps foundation deposits. The dramatic image of a vast hidden archive belongs more to literature than to stratigraphy. Yet the question persists because it invites reflection on how we value knowledge. The idea of lost wisdom preserved in stone speaks to a hope that the past holds answers not yet revealed. The Sphinx, silent and enduring, becomes a symbol of that hope. In measured terms, however, the absence of a chamber beneath the monument means there is no archive to inventory. What has been found are natural cavities and fractured limestone layers. What has not been found are carved rooms filled with records. The endurance of the Hall of Records narrative illustrates how powerful imagery can be when attached to an ancient monument. Even without physical confirmation, the story continues to circulate. It reflects modern fascination more than ancient practice. From this point, the discussion returns to what remains physically present beneath the Sphinx. Limited cavities, geological irregularities, and areas that have been surveyed but left undisturbed, prompting reflection on why certain subsurface features, though mapped, are not pursued further, and what that restraint reveals about the priorities guiding investigation at the site. The Sphinx has been buried more than once. For long stretches of its existence, wind-driven sand rose against its flanks and settled into its enclosure. Only the head remained visible above the desert surface, watching horizons while the body lay concealed. Ancient Egyptians themselves excavated it. Thutmose IV ordered sand cleared from around the Paws. Later restorers repeated the effort. What we see today is the result of cycles of burial and uncovering. It is easy to forget that burial does not only hide secrets, it preserves surfaces, it slows erosion, it alters the story of what is visible and what is not. The sand around the Sphinx has always shifted, and beneath that shifting layer lies not a dramatic hidden chamber, but layers of history, geological, archaeological, and human. Beneath the Sphinx today rests limestone shaped by ancient seas, cut by 4th dynasty workers, fractured by time, and mapped by modern instruments. Seismic waves have passed through it. Radar pulses have reflected off its irregularities. Engineers have studied its density and its stress lines. Archaeologists have lowered lights into known cavities. They have measured shafts, inspected fissures, stabilized weak points. What still rests beneath the sand is stone. That statement may sound simple, but it carries weight. The limestone under the Sphinx is not empty. It is not hollowed into a grand subterranean hall. It is layered, cracked, and weathered. It contains small voids formed by natural processes. It holds the imprint of ancient quarrying. It preserves evidence of environmental change across millennia. What rests beneath the sand also includes the memory of human intervention. 19th century exploratory shafts remain as physical reminders of earlier curiosity. 20th century restoration materials remain embedded in parts of the structure. Modern conservation techniques leave subtle traces where engineers have reinforced weakened layers. These layers of intervention form part of the monument's story. The idea of something dramatic waiting beneath the Sphinx has proven difficult to release. A hidden archive feels proportional to the monument's scale. A sealed chamber feels consistent with its silent gaze. Yet every measured investigation has narrowed the field of possibility. The anomalies detected beneath the surface resolve into fractured limestone rather than constructed rooms. Still, it is not accurate to say that nothing remains unknown. Archaeology rarely provides total closure. The plateau is vast. Technology continues to advance. New imaging methods may one day refine our understanding of subsurface features. The sand will shift again. Future conservation campaigns will examine areas not previously accessible. What remains beneath the sand is potential for further study, but within the boundaries defined by preservation. The Sphinx has endured because it was not carved over a cavern. It has endured because its foundation is largely solid. Its survival is linked to geological stability rather than to hidden architecture. There is a difference between mystery and uncertainty. Mystery suggests something deliberately concealed. Uncertainty reflects the limits of knowledge. Beneath the Sphinx, uncertainty exists in the form of natural variability in limestone layers. That uncertainty does not imply a sealed library. It reflects the complexity of sedimentary rock. The dream stele between the Paws tells a story of a prince who cleared sand and received kingship. It does not describe descending into chambers. It speaks of restoration, not revelation. The ancient Egyptians who lived closest in time to the monument did not record knowledge of a hidden archive beneath it. They treated it as a sacred guardian, not as an entrance. What rests beneath the sand also includes the broader landscape of Giza. Worker villages, quarry trenches, temple foundations and causeways surround the Sphinx. Each of these has yielded evidence through careful excavation. Together they form a coherent archaeological picture. The Sphinx fits within that picture without requiring an unseen addition. The endurance of the hidden chamber narrative tells us something about ourselves. We are drawn to the idea that the past conceals transformative knowledge. We imagine that a single discovery could alter everything we think we know. The Sphinx becomes a focal point for that hope because it feels older than our explanations. Yet there is something steady in the documented findings. Beneath the sand lies the same limestone that ancient workers carved. Beneath that limestone lie deeper geological layers shaped long before human presence. The monument's foundation is not empty space but compressed time. In quiet moments, the absence of a hidden archive does not diminish the Sphinx. Its significance does not depend on a concealed hall. It rests in its scale, its alignment with the pyramid complex, its survival across dynasties, empires, and modern nations. The stone itself carries history without needing a chamber to store it. If one stands before the Sphinx at dusk, when shadows lengthen across the enclosure floor, the question of what lies beneath becomes less urgent. The visible surface already represents a convergence of geology and human intention. The unseen layers support it silently. What still rests beneath the sand is continuity. The plateau remains layered. The monument remains grounded. Investigations have clarified its subsurface without exhausting it. There is room for further study, but within the limits of preservation. The Sphinx does not guard a sealed archive. It guards its own endurance, and as the desert wind moves lightly across the enclosure, carrying grains of sand that will settle and rise again, the stone beneath remains steady, layered, and largely as it has been for thousands of years, supporting the weight of a monument that continues to invite curiosity without surrendering to fantasy.